Hey, welcome back. If your hair curled up lights low, ready to let the night carry you somewhere far away, you're in exactly the right place. I'm really glad you're with me tonight. Close your eyes for just a second. Picture a medieval home. What do you see? Stone walls, tapestries, a grand fireplace big enough to roast a whole deer, a noble family gathered around a long oak table, candles flickering, goblets as wine catching the light. Maybe you see a castle. Maybe you see something out of a movie, warm amber, almost romantic. Now what if I told you that picture is almost completely wrong? What if I told you that the real medieval home, the one where the actual people of the Middle Ages lived their actual lives, looked nothing like that? What if the truth was stranger, darker, more fascinating, and honestly way more interesting than anything Hollywood ever gave you? Tonight we're going back, not to the castles, not to the kings. Tonight we go to the homes that history forgot, the ones where 90 out of every 100 people in medieval Europe spent their entire lives from the first breath to the last. And I promise you, by the time this story's over, you will never look at the Middle Ages the same way again. Before we step through that door together, I just want to take a breath and say, if this kind of storytelling is the thing that makes your nights a little softer, a little more interesting, it would genuinely mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. And hey, drop a comment down below, tell me where you are right now, what time it is, what you're lying on. I love picturing where my listeners are in the world when these stories find them. Only do it if it feels right though, no pressure. Now if you've got the fan nearby, turn it on low. Dim the lights just a touch more. Let's go. Let's start with a confession. For a very long time, even historians got this wrong. The story of the Middle Ages, roughly from the year 500 to the year 1500, has almost always been told from the top down. We know the kings, we know the popes, we know the knights and their shining armour. We know the great cathedrals, the illuminated manuscripts, the philosophical debates in the grand universities of Paris and Oxford. And all of that is real and beautiful and worth knowing. But here is what gets left out almost every single time. Over 90% of the people who lived in medieval Europe were not kings, not knights, not popes. They were farmers, labourers, serfs. Ordinary men and women who woke up before dawn, worked until the sun fell below the horizon, and lived in homes that most modern people would struggle to recognize as homes at all. 90%. Think about that for a moment. If you lined up 100 people from the year 1200, random Europeans plucked from the continent at random, 90 of them would take you to a home that had a dirt floor, a thatched roof, no windows to speak of, and walls made of mud and straw and woven sticks. 90. And yet somehow when we imagine the Middle Ages, we keep picturing the 10. We picture the castles. We picture the feasts. We picture the 1% of 1% who lived behind walls of stone and drank their wine from silver cups. The other 90%, their homes have crumbled. Their names were never written down. Their stories were never considered worth telling until now. So let's ask a question that seems almost too simple but turns out to be wildly fascinating. What did a medieval home actually look like? And the answer, as with almost everything in history, depends entirely on who you were. Because in medieval Europe, where you lived was not just a matter of preference or budget. Where you lived was a statement, a declaration, a reflection of your place in an entire universe of social order that had been built stone by stone over centuries. The peasant in his one-room hut, the merchant in his narrow townhouse, the lord in his manor, the king behind his castle walls, each of them lived in a completely different world, and yet they all shared the same sky, the same seasons, the same fears of plague and famine, and the darkness that came every single night without a single electric light to push it back. That shared darkness is something worth sitting with for a moment, Because for most of human history, for most of the Middle Ages, night was genuinely dark. Not the kind of dark where you can still see the shape of the furniture. The kind of dark where you cannot see your hand in front of your face. The kind of dark that made ordinary people genuinely afraid, because in that darkness anything could be out there. And into that darkness every medieval home, from the grandest castle to the humblest hut, had to carve out a little pocket of warmth and light and safety. How they did that tells us everything about who they were. Now, before we go any further, I want to address the myth head-on, because it is stubborn and it keeps coming back. The myth goes something like this. Medieval people were ignorant and primitive, and their homes were basically just piles of sticks that fell apart after a few years and have left no trace behind. This is wrong. Beautifully, fascinatingly wrong. Here is what we actually know. Historians and archaeologists have spent decades, especially in England, France and Germany, carefully excavating medieval village sites, and what they have found has upended a lot of assumptions. Medieval peasant homes were rectangular. Most were somewhere between 49 and 75 feet long and 13 to 20 feet wide. That is not a shack. That is, by the measures of the time, a real house. Something closer to the size of a modern two-bedroom apartment than the tiny hovels that old paintings would sometimes have you believe. And these homes did not simply collapse after a generation. For a long time, historians assumed that peasant houses were so poorly built that none could survive more than a few decades. But newer research has overturned that entirely. Archaeologists now accept that later medieval homes survive in their thousands, in the foundations, in the timber frames, in the traces left behind in the earth. These were real places, built by real hands, for real families. But here is where it gets interesting and where the real story begins. Because knowing that medieval peasant homes were not tiny hovels does not mean they were comfortable by any stretch of the modern imagination. They were real. They were built with genuine skill and care. And they were, by almost every modern standard, extraordinarily hard to live in. No windows, or windows so small they let in almost no light. No chimney, just a hole in the thatched roof, and a fire burning in the middle of the floor, smoke filling the room and slowly drifting upward if you were lucky. No separation between the family sleeping area and the animals. Yes, the animals. In much of northern Europe, through the coldest winter months, the family shared their single room with the pigs, the chickens, sometimes a cow. Not because they were unaware that this was, shall we say, aromatic, but because those animals were one of the only sources of heat they had. The pig sleeping near the hearth was not a sign of poverty and ignorance. It was a survival strategy. It was warmth. In a world where the wrong winter could mean the difference between life and death, you made peace with your housemates, even if they snored, even if they smelled. And this brings us to something that I think is the most underrated truth about medieval life. Something that no movie, no television show, no romanticized painting has ever really captured. The experience of living in the Middle Ages was above all else, a sensory experience completely unlike anything you and I know. The smell, the darkness, the cold. We will spend time with all of these as our story unfolds tonight. We will walk through the rooms such as they were. We will look at how homes were built, what they contained, how the rich lived versus how the poor lived, and how one catastrophic event, the Black Death, changed medieval housing forever in ways that nobody planned and nobody predicted. But before we get to any of that, I want to leave you with one image. It is the year 1200. Somewhere in the English countryside, in a village of perhaps 200 people, a family is settling in for the night. The fire in the centre of their single room burns low. The mother pulls a rough woolen blanket over two children who are already asleep on a bed of straw. The father sits for a moment watching the embers, listening to the sound of rain on the thatched roof above them. In the corner, a pig shifts in the dark, Outside the village is completely silent. No streetlights, no distant traffic, nothing but the wind. This is home, and it is all they have ever known. And somehow, in some way, that history has mostly failed to capture it was enough. It was enough to build a life in, to raise children in, to love in, to survive in, and tonight we're going to step inside. Now the question is, what did the walls of that home actually look like up close? What were they made of and why? What did it smell like the moment you pushed open that wooden door? And what would you see when your eyes adjusted to the darkness inside? That is exactly where we're going next as we step inside the medieval peasant home and look at the walls, the floors, the fire, and the extraordinary, almost forgotten craft of building a life from mud sticks and the land beneath your feet. Stay with me. So we left off standing at the door. The year is somewhere in the 1200s. The village is quiet. The rain has let up, and there is a dim orange glow slipping through the cracks of the wooden door in front of you. You push it open. And the first thing that hits you before you see anything before your eyes have even adjusted is the smell. Not one smell. Many smells layered together into something your modern nose has absolutely no reference for. Smoke, earth, something animal, something damp, something that might be bread or might be boiled barley, you're not entirely sure. And underneath all of it, that deep wet smell of soil that has never been dry of a floor, that has been walked on for 20 years without ever being properly cleaned. Welcome to the medieval peasant home. This is where we live now. Let us start from the ground up, literally. The floor beneath your feet is dirt. Not tile, not wood, not stone, just the earth itself packed down over years of footsteps until it is almost as hard as concrete. In a house that had been standing for several decades, historians have found something fascinating. The floor level was often actually lower than the ground outside. Think about what that means. Year after year, the family swept the floor, and every time they swept, they removed just a tiny layer of earth. Slowly, almost invisibly, the ground inside the house sank. The outside world stayed put. You would step down when you entered a home like this. You would step into it. There is something almost poetic about that, I think, the way a home literally shapes itself around the lives lived inside it, the floors carrying the memory of every step ever taken. Over that packed earth, a wealthier family might scatter rushes, those long flat reeds you find growing by the river. Fresh rushes had a lovely faintly herbal smell, and they were soft underfoot, and they did a reasonable job of absorbing the mess of daily life. The problem, of course, was that they absorbed all the mess of daily life. Medieval sermons and preachers in the 12 and 1300s actually used the state of peasant floors as a moral metaphor, describe floors strewn with what I will charitably call organic material. Bones from meals past, spilled ale, the contributions of animals wandering freely in and out. A 14th century housewife's daily task, according to one of these sermon accounts, was essentially this: sweep the entire floor together toward the door, shove the pile out, and then watch as the hens immediately came back in and scattered it again. A labour of absolute futility, which somehow feels very relatable. Now let us look at the walls, because this is where something genuinely beautiful happens, something that gets overlooked almost every time. The walls of a medieval peasant home were not, as I said, random piles of mud. They were the product of a building system called wattle and daub, and it is one of those techniques that sounds simple until you actually start looking at the details, and then it becomes quietly extraordinary. Here is how it worked. First you cut your timber. Not just any timber oak was the gold standard, prized for its strength and its resistance to rot. You planted your main upright posts, your structural frame, into the ground or onto flat stones to keep the wood from direct contact with the damp earth. Then between those uprights you wove. Thin branches, usually hazel or willow, chosen specifically because they bend without snapping, were woven horizontally between smaller vertical stakes back and forth, creating a lattice that looks almost like a large basket. This was the wattle. The weaving itself was a skill passed down from parent to child, and a well-woven wattle panel was both flexible and surprisingly strong. Then came the daub. And here is where it gets interesting, because the daub was not simply mud. It was a recipe. A real recipe with specific ingredients chosen for specific purposes. Clay for the main body of the wall, clay binds and holds. Sand or crushed stone to add bulk and prevent cracking. Straw horsehair, sometimes even animal dung mixed in as reinforcement, those fibres wrapped through the clay, the way rebar wraps through concrete, holding the whole thing together as it dried and shrank. The mixture was kneaded often by foot humans and livestock treading through the pile together, in a process that must have been both exhausting and somewhat absurd, and then pressed onto the wattle in layers. First a rough coat, thick and uneven. Then once that dried and was scratched to give grip a smoother finishing layer, and then once everything had set, which took 3 to 4 weeks in good weather, the whole wall was lime-washed. White, brilliant white applied every spring, gleaming in the countryside sunshine. And here is where you need to let go of another wrong picture in your head. When you imagine a medieval timber-framed building, you probably imagine those iconic black and white structures, the dark painted beams, the white panels between them. That picture feels ancient and authentic, almost like it is the most medieval thing you've ever seen. But that style, those dramatically blackened beams, is actually a Victorian fashion, an invention of the 1800s, not the 1200s. Real medieval timber frames were not painted black. The wood aged naturally to a silvery grey. The panels between them were lime-washed in ochre yellow or soft cream, or sometimes painted in simple earthy colours. The medieval village was not dark and sombre. It was under the right light, almost cheerful. Now I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about it. Have you ever been in a place where all the light came from one source, not a lamp, not a phone screen, one source like a campfire or a single candle in a large dark room? That is the closest you can get today to understanding the light inside a medieval peasant home. The one window, if there was a window at all, was small, high on the wall. No glass, because glass was expensive, almost beyond imagination for ordinary people. Just wooden shutters thrown open in warm weather, closed at night, and in winter to keep the cold out. Open meant light came in, but it also meant wind, rain, and whatever else the outside world decided to send through. Nighttime light came from rushlights, those reeds stripped down and soaked in rendered animal fat set in a simple iron holder. They gave off a small wavering glow and a faint smell of tallow. They burned for perhaps an hour. You did not sit and read by a rushlight. You did your final task quickly by that orange flicker, and then you went to bed. Because in the medieval world, the rhythm of the household was the rhythm of the sun. You rose when it rose, you worked while it was there, and when it left you, in most cases, also stopped. But here is the thing that I keep coming back to, the detail that feels almost too intimate to say out loud. The fire. That fire burning in the centre of the floor, and in most peasant homes, well into the 14 and 1500s, it burned in the centre of the floor with no chimney, just a hole in the roof above it. That fire was the soul of the medieval home. It cooked the food, it warmed the room, it kept the animals quiet at night. It dried the wet clothes hanging from the rafters. It was never allowed to go completely out, because striking a new fire with flint and steel in a cold, damp room at 5 in the morning was nobody's idea of a good start to the day. Modern researchers, archaeologists who have actually rebuilt and inhabited reconstructed medieval longhouses to study how they functioned, found something significant. The smoke levels inside these homes with an open central hearth and limited ventilation were considerably higher than anything we would consider safe today. higher in fact than levels found in modern developing world homes that still use biomass for cooking and heating. The walls were black with it. The rafters were black. Your clothes were black. Your hair smelled of smoke every single day of your life. And yet, and this is the part that history almost never says, that smoke was also doing something useful. Hanging from those smoke-blackened rafters were hams, sides of salted pork, dried herbs, smoked fish. The smoke that was slowly irritating the lungs of every person in the house was simultaneously curing and preserving the food that would keep them alive through the winter. The medieval hearth was not a problem to be solved. It was a system, a complete integrated system of warmth, cooking, light and food preservation, all from one fire burning in a pile of packed clay in the middle of a dirt floor. Not primitive, not ignorant, just different, radically different from everything we know. Now, one more thing before we move on, because I think it matters. There is a detail that comes up in accounts from the period and from the people who have recreated these spaces that almost never makes it into the history books. When the daub on those walls was fresh, really fresh, newly applied, still slightly damp, it had a smell. A good smell, actually. Clay and straw and something almost mineral, something clean and earthy. And the thatched roof above new thatch had a smell too. A dry, dusty sweetness, the smell of cut wheat in autumn. A new medieval home, newly built and freshly lime-washed, smelled the way a country field smells after rain. Before the fire had filled it with smoke, before the animals had been brought in for the winter, before the rushes on the floor had absorbed a season's worth of daily life. For a brief moment just at the beginning it was just walls and wood and the clean smell of the earth, and a family standing at the door looking in at everything they had built. So now we know what the walls were made of and how they were built and how the light moved through those rooms and what the smoke did. But here is what we have not yet talked about, and it is honestly the detail that stops me every time I think about it. Who was inside that house, not just the family? Because in the medieval home, the question of who lives here is far more complicated and far more fascinating than you might expect. The full truth about who shared the roof, the fire, and sometimes even the bed in a medieval peasant home is one of the things that truly sets this world apart from ours. And that is exactly where we are headed next. Right then, who actually lived inside that home? That was the question we left hanging at the end of the last part, and I want to answer it properly. Not with a list, with a picture. So let us build it slowly. Picture a Thursday evening sometime in the year 1240. The village of perhaps 150 people sits in a shallow valley in what we now call the English Midlands. The sun has been down for about an hour. Most of the field work is done, for the season harvest was weeks ago, and the first real cold has moved in. The sky outside is clear and absolutely completely black, with more stars than anyone born after the invention of electric light has ever seen. Inside one particular home, a longhouse, they call it one long rectangular space running perhaps 60 feet from end to end, there is noise. Not the chaos you might expect. Something warmer than that. Here is the first thing you have to understand about who lived in a medieval peasant home. And it is the thing that breaks most of our modern assumptions cleanest in half. The word family. In the way we use it today, two parents, their children, that neat and self-contained unit that we consider so natural and obvious, that concept barely existed in medieval rural Europe. Not because people did not love their children, not because marriages were not real, but because the boundaries of the household were drawn so much wider than anything we recognize now. In that long house in the 1200s, you might find the husband and wife the core of the household, yes, their children of varying ages. Perhaps a grandmother or an elderly father unable to work the fields any longer, but still very much part of the household. Maybe a teenage boy from a neighbouring family placed here at age 12 or 13 to learn the skills of farming from a more experienced household. This was called service, and it was not servitude in the modern sense. It was closer to an apprenticeship in life. The boy slept here, ate here, worked here, and was treated, if not quite like a son, then like a permanent fixture of the household, who had specific rights and specific duties. And at the other end of the longhouse, the cattle. Yes, the cattle were family too, in a manner of speaking. The longhouse design, this single structure, where humans occupied one end and animals the other, separated by nothing more than a rough partition of wood, or sometimes just an open passage, was not a universal feature of every medieval home in Europe. But in the upland regions of Britain, in Wales, in large parts of northern England, in Brittany and parts of Scandinavia, it was extraordinarily common. And the archaeology has been very revealing about why. Researchers who have excavated longhouse sites in Devon and Cornwall found that the byre end of these structures, the animal end, was built to accommodate anywhere from 6 to 10 head of cattle. Not a chicken or two. Actual cattle through the entire winter. Why does this matter? Because a single cow produces something in the range of 2,000 watts of heat. Just standing there breathing being a cow, and 6 to 10 cows packed into an enclosed space at the other end of your home, with the shared warmth drifting through that partition and pooling through the living space that is central heating. Medieval central heating. Smelly, loud, occasionally very messy medieval central heating, but warmth nonetheless. Real life-saving warmth in a world where the wrong winter could kill you in a home with no insulation, no glass in the windows and a thatched roof that let the cold seep down from above. I find myself genuinely in awe of this when I think about it carefully. These people looked at a problem, how do we stay warm when we have almost nothing, and they solved it by thinking in systems rather than in comforts. The cow is not an inconvenience. The cow is the furnace. Now let us talk about sleeping, because this is where part 3 of our story gets genuinely deeply strange by modern standards, and I mean that in the most fascinating possible way. Here is a question I want you to sit with for a moment. How many people do you think slept in that longhouse on a cold November night in 1240? Take a guess. Just think about it, because the answer is almost certainly more than you imagined. And the way they slept, the actual physical arrangement of bodies, the sharing of space and warmth, the almost complete absence of anything we would recognize as privacy, is one of the most startling windows into a lost world that history gives us. Let us start with the beds. A peasant family's bed was not in most cases a raised wooden frame with a mattress. That came later, and when it came, it was a luxury. What most families slept on was a pallet, a sack or a mat stuffed with straw-dried ferns or rough wool laid directly on the floor near the hearth where the embers would still be glowing. Husband and wife shared this pallet. Their youngest child, or in many accounts even the infant, slept alongside them, or in a small cradle placed near the fire. Older children slept on the floor nearby on their own pallets, or simply wrapped in blankets. The teenage boy who was learning the trade of the household. He slept on the floor too, somewhere in the main room with whatever blanket or cloak he owned pulled over him. Nobody had a room. Nobody had a corner that was specifically permanently theirs. When you went to sleep in a medieval peasant home, you were going to sleep as part of a group in a shared space surrounded by the sounds and warmth of other people breathing. There was nothing unusual about this. It was simply how the world worked. And here is where it gets even more interesting, and I promise this is one of those facts that once you hear it you will think about every time you wake up in the middle of the night. The historian Roger E. Kirch of Virginia Tech spent over 2 decades compiling evidence from medieval and early modern documents, court records, literary sources, medical texts, personal diaries, and made a discovery that genuinely upended what most of us thought we knew about sleep. Medieval people did not sleep the way you and I sleep. They did not go to bed and stay there for 7 or 8 hours straight. They slept in 2 distinct phases. The first sleep began shortly after dark, perhaps around 8 or 9 in the evening, depending on the season. It lasted several hours, carrying people through to somewhere around midnight, and then they woke up, voluntarily, naturally, without alarm. For an hour, sometimes 2, the household was awake in the middle of the night. This period between what Ekirk calls first sleep and second sleep was not an anomaly, not a problem to be solved. It was expected. It was normal. It was for many almost sacred. What did people do during this hour? Everything, apparently. A physician writing in the 16th century recommended this interval as the ideal time to conceive a child. Medieval monks were woken for prayers at around 2 in the morning, a practice so formalized it was written into monastic rules. Farmers used the hour to check on their animals. Neighbors occasionally visited neighbors. People prayed, reflected on the dreams they had just had, thought through problems. A few, it seems, brewed ale. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the late 1300s, casually drops a reference to a character waking from her first sleep in the Canterbury Tales. Not as something remarkable, not as something requiring explanation, but as a passing detail so ordinary that no reader of his time would have blinked. First sleep, second sleep, 2 sleeps with a quiet hour of gentle wakefulness in between. Ekirch found references to this pattern not only in England but in France, where it was called the premier somme in Italy, where it was the primo sonno in documents stretching from medieval Europe to Africa to South America to the Middle East. This was not a quirk of one culture or one era. This was for most of human history simply how human beings rested. It was only the Industrial Revolution, the gas lamps, then the electric lights, the factories demanding people be at their posts at 6 in the morning and stay productive until the whistle blew, that compressed our sleep into the single unbroken block we now consider natural. Our modern insomnia, that panic you feel when you wake at 3 in the morning and cannot get back to sleep. There is a real argument to be made, and serious researchers have made it, that what you're experiencing is not a disorder. It is your body remembering something very ancient. But I want to go back to that longhouse, back to that cold November night, because there is something I have been building toward, and I think it is the most quietly profound thing I want to say in this whole section. Imagine lying on your pallet in the darkness. The embers of the fire glow orange through the haze of smoke that never fully clears. Somewhere behind the wooden partition, one of the cattle shifts and settles. A child makes a soft sound in their sleep. Your spouse's breathing slows and deepens, and at some hour past midnight you open your eyes. The room is almost dark, but not quite. The embers give just enough light to see the shapes of the people around you, the sleeping forms of your children, the slow rise and fall of their chests. Through the cracks in the shuttered window you can see nothing but absolute blackness, but you can hear the wind picking up outside, and you know it will be a hard morning. You do not reach for a phone. There is no phone. There is no light you can switch on, no scroll to mindlessly consume. There is just the darkness and the fire and the people you love, and perhaps 30 minutes of quiet thought before the second sleep pulls you under again. And here is the thing. A historian who studies this period, the medieval scholar Jean Verdon, who wrote extensively about night in the Middle Ages, noted that contemporary accounts describe this interval between sleeps as a time of unusual mental clarity. The vivid quality of the dreams that came just before this waking made them feel significant, almost like messages. People prayed during this hour or reflected, or simply lay quietly in a state that one modern researcher described as equivalent chemically to what you might feel after spending a day at a spa. A state of deep calm, of presence, of being exactly where you are with no anxiety about what comes next. I do not want to romanticize medieval poverty. I am aware that life in this longhouse was also cold and sick and exhausting, and sometimes desperate. We will get to all of that. But I do think there is something in this image worth holding for a moment. Those people lying in the dark between their first sleep and their second, surrounded by warmth and breath, and the sound of animals settling in for the night. They were experiencing something that we, with all our mattresses and blackout curtains and sleep tracking apps, have mostly lost. A certain kind of quiet, a certain kind of enough. Now, everything we have talked about in these last 3 parts, the walls, the fire, the floors, the animals, the sleep, this is the world of the 90%, the peasant world, the world that history mostly forgot. But just a short walk down the road from that longhouse in every medieval village across Europe, there was another kind of home. A home built not to survive but to impress. Not to keep the cold out, but to announce to every person who walked past exactly who lived inside and exactly how much power they held. The shift from the peasant home to the home of the nobility is not just a shift in comfort. It is a shift in an entirely different philosophy of what a home is supposed to do. And that is the story we carry into the next part of this journey. Walk with me now. We're leaving the longhouse behind, leaving the embers, the cattle, the straw pallets, the smoky rafters with their hanging hams. We step back out through that low wooden door into the cold morning air of the village, and we walk maybe half a mile, maybe less, and we stop. Because ahead of us, rising above the tree line, is something that would have stopped every single person in that village cold. Every morning, every day of their lives. A building so different from everything they inhabited that it might as well have been built by a different species. This is the manor house. And the first thing you need to understand about it, the thing that rewires how you think about medieval architecture entirely, is this. It was not built to be comfortable. It was built to make you feel small. There is a phrase I keep coming back to when I think about medieval noble homes, and it comes from the historian who described the manor house as a physical embodiment of authority. Not a home, an embodiment. A 3-dimensional argument made in stone and timber and glass for why one person had the right to control the lives of everyone around them. Think about that for a moment. When a lord commissioned his manor house, and many did commission them specifically with careful attention to how they would appear from the road, from the village, from the fields where his tenants worked, he was not simply building a place to live. He was writing a sentence in the language of power. A sentence that said, I am permanent, I am serious, I am not going anywhere. The peasant's wattle and daub cottage could be built in a matter of weeks, and would return to the earth in a generation. The lord's manor house was built of stone, cut stone, shaped stone, fitted stone, the kind of stone that says centuries, not seasons. And the size of that stone building told you without a single word being spoken exactly how much power its owner held. Let me take you to a specific place, because the best way I know to feel this is to stand inside it. In the county of Kent in southern England, there is a manor house that was built in the year 1341 for a man named Sir John de Pulteney. He was a wool merchant who had become extraordinarily wealthy. Wealthy enough to have been elected Lord Mayor of London 4 separate times. And when he decided to build his country home, he built something that still stands today, nearly 700 years later, in almost its original form. It is called Penshurst Place. And the heart of it, the room that Sir John clearly considered the statement he most needed to make, is the Great Hall. The original chestnut timber roof of that hall, those beams are still there. Still the same wood that was cut and fitted in 1341. You can walk under them today, and when you stand in that hall and look up, the first thing that hits you is the sheer scale of the space. Not the grandeur exactly, not the ornament, but just the height, the volume, the amount of air above you. In a world where most people lived their entire lives in a single room, the size of a modern studio apartment, with a ceiling of smoke-blackened thatch, just above their heads, this ceiling, this height, this openness was something close to miraculous. That was exactly the point. Now here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you were a peasant tenant, someone who worked this lord's land, owed him taxes, needed his permission to marry, to move, sometimes even to grind your own grain at the mill, and you were called to the manor to appear before the manorial court, what would walking into a room like this do to you? I think about this more than is probably reasonable, because the answer is not just it impressed you. That is too simple. It did something more specific, more architectural. It reminded you with absolute physical immediacy of the distance between your world and his. Your world had a dirt floor and a fire in the middle and a ceiling you could almost touch. His world had a floor of fitted stone or compacted clay laid over generations. It had a hearth so large you could stand inside it. It had windows, actual windows, unglazed perhaps in the early period, but large enough to let real light pour across the floor. It had a raised platform at the far end, the dais, where the Lord's table sat elevated above everyone else's, where even the act of eating was a performance of hierarchy. The architectural historian Bruce Holsinger has written about how medieval halls were essentially theatres, spaces designed not just to contain activity, but to choreograph it. Where you entered, where you sat, how close you were to the dais, whether you were above or below a certain threshold in the room, all of this was visible, legible, permanent. Everyone knew their place because the building told them, and at the very top of that theatre, the man who owned all of it sat behind his table at the highest point in the room with the best light and the warmest fire, looking out at everyone who depended on him. Let us talk about what those walls actually looked like, because this is another place where the popular imagination gets it significantly wrong. We tend to picture medieval noble interiors as bare stone grey cold echoing, maybe a few torches on iron brackets. The reality was closer to a riot of colour. The walls of a prosperous manor house's great hall were hung with tapestries. Real tapestries woven in wool and sometimes silk in deep reds and blues and golds, depicting hunting scenes, heraldic symbols, scenes from scripture, episodes from the legends of King Arthur and his knights. These tapestries were not simply decoration, they were insulation. They kept the draughts from the cold stone walls away from the people inside, and they are also the medieval equivalent of a gallery wall, each one a statement of taste, of wealth, of connection to a wider world of culture and craft. The walls behind and between the tapestries were often painted, sometimes in bold red and white lines imitating stonework, sometimes with painted foliage or heraldic designs. Medieval noble homes were not grey. They were covered in ochre and vermilion, in earthy greens and deep blues made from costly pigments. And then there were the floors, not dirt, not packed earth. In a prosperous hall, the floor might be laid with rush matting fresher and cleaner than what the peasants used changed, more regularly scattered with herbs that released their scent when walked upon. In a very wealthy hall there might be tiles, actual ceramic tiles, sometimes in patterns, sometimes glazed underfoot, where the Lord's guests would walk. One medieval sermon records the way a well-kept hall floor smelled at Easter, strewn with green rushes and sweet flowers. At Christmas, strewn with fresh straw. The hall was meant to smell of the season, to change with the year, to remind everyone in it that the world outside moved through its cycles while the Lord's house remained. But here is the thing that I find most fascinating about the medieval manor house, and it is something that the architecture itself makes visible in a way that words almost cannot. The manor house was not just a building, it was a claim. In the feudal system, land was not simply land. It was obligation, relationship, military service, judicial power, rent, loyalty, protection, all bundled together into a single complicated transaction that ran from the king at the top all the way down to the serf who could not leave the village without asking permission. And the manor house sat at the centre of all of that. The great hall was where the manorial court met, where tenants came to answer for disputes, to settle questions of land tenure, to pay their dues. The Lord did not simply live in this building, he administered justice from it. He received guests of his own rank in it. He held feasts in it at Christmas and Easter feasts where his tenants were sometimes fed, as well a calculated display of generosity that reinforced dependency as much as gratitude. Almost every large manor house had its own deer park enclosed by royal license. This was not primarily for recreation. It was a food supply venison carefully managed reserved for the Lord's table. No one else could hunt in it. The deer in that park were a daily visible reminder of who controlled the resources, and nearly every manor had its own mill, a water mill usually built on the closest stream. And here is the detail that historians find utterly revealing. The peasants were not simply allowed to use this mill. They were required to use it, required to bring their grain here to no other mill, and to pay the Lord a percentage of their flour for the privilege. The mill was not a convenience offered to the village. The mill was a tax made of stone and wood sitting by the water turning every day. Now, something I want to be careful about here, because I think the easy move is to look at all of this and reach for a simple verdict. To say these lords were cynical, these halls were manipulation, this beauty was just a disguise for exploitation, and yes, some of that is true. But I have spent enough time with this material to believe that it is not the whole truth, because many of these lords genuinely believed in what they were doing, not in a naive way, in a deeply medieval way. They believed that the social order they inhabited, the hierarchy that placed them above their tenants and below the king, was not an accident of power. It was the will of God. It was the natural order of things. Their job was not to escape that hierarchy, but to fulfill their role in it correctly, to be generous at feast times, to protect their tenants from outside threats, to dispense fair judgment in the manorial court. Did they always do those things? No, obviously not. But the manor house at its best was built in the spirit of that belief. It was not only a monument to self-interest, it was also in its own way a statement of responsibility. This is my place, and I will not abandon it, and the people who depend on me will know where to find me. The lord who built Penshurst Place in 1341 spent 4,000 acres worth of wealth on a building that would outlast him by 7 centuries. I wonder sometimes what he thought he was building. We've now walked through 2 worlds, the 90% who built their homes from the earth itself, and the lords who built theirs to outlast generations. But there is a 3rd world in medieval Europe that almost nobody talks about, and it sits right between those two. Not in the countryside, not behind a moat or a deer park. It sits in the narrow, crowded, surprisingly sophisticated streets of the medieval town, and the homes of the medieval merchant class, the traders, the guild musters, the men and women who were slowly, quietly rewriting the rules of who could build in stone and who could not, are among the most fascinating and most overlooked stories in all of medieval architecture. That is exactly where we're going next. Something shifts the moment you leave the countryside behind. The open fields narrow, the road tightens, and then before you quite realize it is happening, you're no longer walking through a world of scattered farmsteads and isolated manor houses. You're walking into a world of noise, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the shout of a street vendor, the creak of a cart over cobblestone, the smell of bread from a baker's window mixing with something considerably less pleasant from the ditch running along the side of the road. Welcome to the medieval town, and welcome to the world that history forgets almost as thoroughly as it forgets the peasant in the longhouse, the world of the merchant, the craftsman, the guild master, the world of the medieval middle. Here is the first thing that strikes you about a medieval town, and I think it is the thing that stays with you longest. The buildings lean, not dramatically, not as if they are about to fall, but there is a quality to a medieval town street, and you can still feel it if you walk through the older parts of York in England, or Strasbourg in France, or Quedlinburg in Germany, where the upper floors of the houses on either side of the street angle slightly toward each other, as if the buildings are trying to have a conversation above your head. This was not an accident, and it was not neglect. It was engineering. The technique was called jettying, and it is one of those medieval inventions so clever, so quietly brilliant, that it makes you genuinely respect the people who devised it. Here is the problem that jettying solved. In a medieval, townland was expensive, or at least street frontage was. The more of the main street your building faced, the more visible your shop was, the more customers you could attract. But townspeople were also paying taxes on that frontage, and the plots themselves were narrow squeezed between neighbouring buildings in long, thin strips running back from the street. So if your ground floor was only 12 or 15 feet wide and you could not afford to buy the plot next door, how did you get more space? You built upward, and then you made each floor slightly larger than the one below it, cantilevering the upper story out beyond the frame of the lower, projecting it over the street by a foot or two, or sometimes more. A 3-story merchant's house built with jettied floors could end up considerably wider at the top than at the bottom. And in the densest streets, the old city of York has a street called the Shambles, which still exists today, still with its original medieval buildings leaning overhead. The upper floors on opposite sides of the street came so close together that neighbours could reportedly reach out their windows and shake hands across the gap. I want you to think about what that meant for the street below. No sunlight, almost none. At street level, in the narrow lanes between these leaning timber towers, the medieval town was a world of shadow and smells and perpetual semi-darkness, even in the middle of the day. The upper floors caught the light. The people at street level lived in the shade of their neighbours' prosperity. Now let me take you into a specific building, because the best way to understand the medieval merchant's home is not to describe it in abstract terms, but to walk through one that actually still exists. In the old city of Southampton, England, on a street called French Street, there is a house built in approximately the year 1290. It was built for a man named John Fortin, a wine merchant who made his living importing wine from France through one of England's busiest ports. The medieval merchant's house, as it is now known, is described by the historian Glyn Coppack as the only building of its type to have survived substantially as first built. And what makes it extraordinary is not just its age. It is what its layout reveals about how a medieval merchant actually lived, and more specifically about the radical way that the merchant home collapsed the boundaries between work and life that we now take completely for granted. Let us walk through it. The front of the building faces the street with a shop front on the ground floor. Not a separate shop, not a different address. The front of your home is your place of business. The wooden planks across the bottom of the ground floor window are hinged. They fold down to create a counter, and you sell from behind it directly to the people passing by on the street. When you're done for the day, you fold the counter back up and it becomes a window again. Your shop and your home share the same front door. Behind the shop is the central hall, the heart of the house where the family gathers, eats, receives guests. It is a real room, properly furnished with a hearth and walls that in the original version would have been hung with cloths or painted in colours that an archaeologist might later describe as surprisingly vivid. Beneath the house in the undercroft, a vaulted cellar cut directly into the earth below the floor are the barrels of wine, temperature stable, cool year-round. This is not a storage afterthought. This is a designed, engineered feature. The merchant who built this house thought about the wine barrels as carefully as he thought about the bedrooms, and above the hall on the first floor are the bedchambers. The east bedchamber projects out over the street, jettied, gaining those precious extra feet of floor space. The carpenters who built this room left their maker's marks on the timbers, small personal signatures cut into the wood 700 years ago that you can still see today. This house was built around 1300. It outlasted wars, fires, plagues, centuries of changing ownership. A German bombing raid in 1940 blew open the Victorian-era modifications and revealed the medieval interior underneath. As if the house was waiting for someone to finally look inside and see what it had always been. Here is the thing about the medieval merchant's home that I find most thought-provoking, and I want to share it as a genuine observation rather than a historical fact. The merchant lived differently from both the peasant and the lord, and the difference was not simply about wealth. It was about a different relationship with time, with space, with the concept of what a home is supposed to provide. The peasant's home was about survival, warmth in winter, enough food stored in the rafters, enough space to sleep and eat and work. It was not a statement, it was a shell, a necessary one, a beloved one perhaps, but a shell. The Lord's home was about authority, the great hall that made you feel small, the dais that put the Lord above you, the walls that announce permanence and power. The Lord did not live in his home so much as he governed from it. But the merchant's home was something newer, something almost proto-modern. It was about efficiency, about the integration of commerce and domesticity into a single intelligently designed space, about the idea that your home could be simultaneously a place of work, a place of display, a place of family life, and a place of storage, all stacked vertically in a narrow plot on a busy street, and that this integration was not a compromise but a solution. When I stand on a street like the Shambles in York and look up at those overhanging timber frames, I do not see poverty or chaos. I see problem solving. I see people who are working with a very specific set of constraints, limited land, limited money, maximum ambition, and building the most sophisticated response to those constraints that their materials and their knowledge allowed. Does any of that sound familiar, by the way? Does that remind you even slightly of the way that modern urban apartments are built? Stacked, compressed, integrated, every square foot serving more than one purpose? It should. Because in a very real way the medieval merchant invented the modern city apartment. Just with more leaning, more sawdust, and considerably worse sanitation. About that sanitation, I would be doing you a disservice if I painted the medieval town as only charming and ingenious, without also being honest about what it actually smelled like. The answer by all accounts is very bad. The streets were narrow, unpaved in most areas, and served as the primary disposal route for everything a household needed to dispose of. A medieval townsperson emptying a chamber pot from an upper floor window was not being inconsiderate. They were following a standard procedure, just one that involved shouting a warning first. The French phrase was garde l'eau, meaning watch out for the water, which the English eventually shortened to the word that is now used very differently. In 1235, a fire that started on London Bridge spread across a large section of the city. In 1135, another fire had damaged St. Paul's Cathedral. Fire was not an occasional hazard in medieval towns. It was a permanent, ever-present danger baked into the physics of having thousands of timber-frame buildings packed tightly together, all heated by open fire, all within easy reach of each other's sparks. London responded by passing the Assize of 1389, requiring that the lower floors of new buildings be built in stone and their roofs be tiled rather than thatched. Not because stone was more beautiful, because stone does not burn. The merchant who could afford stone on his ground floor was not just protecting his investment. He was participating in one of the first urban building codes in English history, an early imperfect, desperately necessary attempt to make city living survivable. But here is what I keep coming back to, even through the smoke and the smells and the leaning buildings. The medieval town was the most socially radical place in medieval Europe. You have to understand what that means in context. Outside the town walls, every person had a fixed place in the hierarchy. The serf could not leave his lord's land. the free peasant was still subject to manorial obligations. Birth determined almost everything: your work, your home, your prospects. Inside the town walls, that logic was partially suspended. There is a phrase from the period, a legal principle that became widely established across much of medieval Europe: Stadtluft macht frei. It is German, and it means city air makes you free. The idea was precise and legally meaningful. If a serf escaped to a chartered town and lived there for a year and a day without being reclaimed by their lord, they gained legal freedom. Freedom. From a year of simply existing inside the walls of a town. The merchant class that built those leaning timber houses, that designed those undercrofts for wine, and those jettied upper floors for sleeping, they were not just building homes, they were building a different kind of world. A world where what you made, what you traded, what you knew mattered more than who your father was. That world was fragile. It was dirty. It burned down with alarming regularity. But it was pointing toward something, toward the idea that a person could build themselves a life, rather than simply inherit one. And the house they built to live in while doing it was narrow and overhanging and smoky and full of wine barrels in the basement. And I find it honestly one of the most interesting homes in all of medieval Europe. Now we've spent time inside the homes of the 90% and the homes of the lords, and now the homes of the emerging merchant class. But there is still a layer of this story we've not yet touched, and it is the layer that most of us would recognize most immediately if we walked into it. Because everything we have talked about, the peasant's single room, the lord's great hall, the merchant's integrated shop and dwelling, all of it, operated under a set of assumptions about who lived in a home, how a home was organized, and above all, how much privacy a person was entitled to. And those assumptions were about to change. The story of that change, the slow, quiet revolution, in how medieval people thought about the concept of a private room, a private life, a space that belonged to you and you alone, is one of the most fascinating stories in the entire history of domestic architecture. And it starts with a room that most people have never heard of in a corner of the manor house that nobody thought to look at carefully until quite recently. There is a room in Stokesay Castle in Shropshire, England, that I want you to know about. Stokesay was built in the late 1300s, a fortified manor house, not quite a castle, not quite a simple manor, but something in between, sitting near the border of Wales, like it can't quite make up its mind what it wants to be. And within that building, reached by a spiral staircase carved into the thickness of the wall itself, is a solar. It is not a large room. It is comfortable, or at least it was designed to be comfortable. South-facing windows draw in as much winter light as possible. A fireplace on one wall. Space enough for a bed, a chair, a chest of personal belongings. Room enough for 2 people, perhaps 3, to sit quietly together. Room enough, most importantly, to close the door. And that door, the act of closing it, the ability to close it, the very idea that closing it was an option, is the story of part 6. Because what happened to the medieval home between roughly the 12th and 15th centuries is one of the most quietly revolutionary changes in the entire history of how human beings live. And almost nobody tells it this way. Let me back up. We've talked about the Great Hall, that enormous communal theatre of power space at the heart of the medieval noble home, and we established that in the earliest period everyone lived there. Everyone slept there. Lord and servants and guests and knights and children all together in one room with a fire in the centre and pallets on the floor, and no meaningful boundary between one person's existence and another's. This was not considered primitive. It was not considered a problem. In fact, for much of the early Middle Ages, the idea that a person might want to be alone, to sleep alone, to eat alone, to conduct their private business out of sight of their household, would have seemed not only unusual but faintly suspicious. Think about what privacy actually requires. It requires the belief that you are a self, a specific individual with inner thoughts and experiences that are yours and no one else's. It requires the belief that some of those thoughts and experiences are worth protecting from view, and it requires the social environment to agree with you to accept that your need for a closed door is legitimate rather than antisocial. None of those conditions were fully present in the early medieval world, but something began to shift, very slowly, in the space between the 12th and 14th centuries, and the evidence of that shift is written into the architecture itself visible if you know how to look in the floor plans of surviving manor houses across England and France. The first shift was surprisingly modest. At the upper end of the great hall, the dais end where the lord sat, a curtain was hung. Just a curtain. A heavy woolen curtain stretched across a wooden rod, creating a small partitioned space behind the lord's table where he and his family could retire after the meal. Not a room, just a curtain. But that curtain represented something enormous, the first formal acknowledgement built into the physical structure of the home that the person who lived there might have needs, or perhaps secrets that did not need to be shared with the assembled household. Over the following decades and generations, the curtain became a wooden screen. The screen became a partition. The partition became a wall. The wall gained a door. The door gained a staircase. And up that staircase on the first floor above the hall, where the light was better and the noise from below was muffled, appeared the solar. This progression from curtain to room took roughly 200 years. 200 years for the idea of private space to work its way from a temporary fabric divider into actual load-bearing stone. Now here is the question I genuinely want you to sit with for a moment. Why did it happen at all? Why, after centuries of communal living that nobody seemed to question, did medieval lords and ladies begin to want something different? The historians who have studied this most carefully point to several forces working together. The first was the influence of women. This is underappreciated but significant. Many of the Solar's earliest documented advocates were the senior women of great households, the lady of the manor, the countess, the lord's wife, who were navigating a world that was overwhelmingly public, overwhelmingly male, and overwhelmingly noisy. The great hall was the lord's stage. The Solar became in part a space that senior women could claim as their own, a place to oversee the household's domestic accounts, to supervise the weaving and embroidery that was central to noble women's economic role, to speak privately to servants and family members without the entire household as audience. The second force was simply the growth of household administration. As medieval estates became larger and more complex through the 13th and 14th centuries, the lord's business managing rents, settling disputes, corresponding with other lords, keeping accounts required paperwork discretion and quiet concentration. None of those things were possible in the middle of a busy great hall. And the third force, the one that I think is most interesting from a purely human perspective, was something that historians describe cautiously as the emergence of the individual self. Let me explain what I mean by that. In the early Middle Ages, a person's identity was almost entirely defined by their relationships. You were someone's son, someone's vassal, someone's servant. Your obligations, your rights, your reputation, your very survival, all of it was embedded in a web of social connections that surrounded you completely and that required constant visible maintenance. Being alone was not desirable. Being alone was potentially dangerous practically because it meant being outside the protective web, and spiritually because medieval theology was genuinely concerned about the state of the solitary individual who was considered vulnerable to exactly the kinds of dark thoughts that unmonitored quietness was believed to produce. But by the late 13th and 14th centuries, something was changing in how educated Europeans understood themselves. Scholars were reading new translations of ancient philosophy. Petrarch, writing in 14th century Italy, famously described going into solitude on a hillside and finding it not frightening but nourishing a space for self-reflection that he considered genuinely valuable. The idea that being alone with your own thoughts might be good for you, this was not ancient wisdom in the medieval European context. It was a new, somewhat radical idea. And the solar was, among other things, the physical expression of that idea built in stone. By the late 14th century, the solar had evolved further. Britannica's architectural records describe it as being commonly called by that point the retiring room, a name that captures the shift perfectly. Not a withdrawal from danger, a withdrawal from company, a deliberate chosen retreat into quietness. Inside a well-appointed solar of this period you would find a fireplace. Almost certainly a fireplace, because warmth and comfort were now considered legitimate goals for a room, rather than luxuries to be apologized for. You would find a substantial bed with curtains that could be drawn around it, providing within the already private room a further interior enclosure of privacy. You would find a chair, which was still rare enough in the medieval world that its presence here was a statement. You would find chests of personal belongings, locked the lock itself a meaningful detail, and you would find in some solars a small window. Not a window looking outside, a window looking down into the great hall below. In Scotland, these hidden observation points were called the Laird's Lug, the Lord's Ear. In French, they were called the Judas, a name loaded with obvious associations. In English, they were called squints. A tiny hole artfully disguised in the carving above the hall doorway, or cut into the thickness of the solar floor through which the Lord could look down at the assembled household without being seen himself. Think about what that tells us. Here is a man who has retreated from his hall into his private room. He has sought solitude, quiet at the closed door. And yet he has also had his builders cut a spy hole so he can keep watching. He wants privacy. But he cannot quite trust what happens when he is not there. I find this utterly, completely human. The tension in that squint hole, the desire for solitude, and the anxiety about absence feels like something we understand today without any historical translation required. Now let us talk briefly about the room that existed alongside the solar, and that tells a genuinely strange story about how medieval people understood the relationship between bodily functions and social dignity. The garderobe. The word itself is French, meaning guard the robes, a wardrobe, a place to keep your valuable clothing, and that is exactly what it originally was. A small room attached to the solar with locked presses and chests for storing the household's most valuable fabric goods, the embroidered curtains, the finely woven blankets, the Lord's best clothing, the table linens, a room devoted to protecting expensive cloth. But here is the part that makes you stop. Over time, and the exact reasons are debated by historians, with some arguing it was purely practical, and others suggesting something more interesting about the medieval sense of smell. The garderobe also became the toilet. The medieval castle toilet, a small projecting chamber cantilevered off the outer wall, with a hole in the floor or seat through which waste dropped directly to the outside, sometimes into a cesspit, sometimes into the moat. Occasionally, as at Château Gaillard in France, most dramatically into a shaft that proved exploitable by attacking soldiers who climbed it to enter the castle. The same word garderobe for both the closet where you kept your finest silk brocade and the room where you did your most private business. Some historians have suggested that the close proximity was actually intentional. The ammonia from the waste was believed to repel moths and other textile-destroying insects. So hanging your best robes in the garderobe was not as bizarre as it sounds. It was practical in the specific unromantic way that medieval practicality so often was. But I think there is something else worth observing. The garderobe, whether used for clothing or for bodily functions, was the most private room in the medieval house. The room you went to alone. The room that had a specific lock, a specific purpose, a specific level of seclusion that no other room in the building could match. In other words, the first truly private room in the European domestic tradition was not the study, not the salon, not the bedroom. It was the bathroom. By the end of the 15th century, the architecture of privacy had evolved considerably. Guest rooms had appeared spaces designed specifically for visitors who were no longer expected to sleep on the floor of the hall. A buttery had been placed between the kitchen and the main hall, a practical invention that also significantly created a visual and physical separation between the servants' working world and the family's social one. Historians of architecture point out that this period represents the moment when the house stopped being organized around the single shared room and started being organized around the movement of people through a sequence of spaces. You did not arrive in the hall and stay there. You moved through, progressing from public to semi-private to private, depending on your relationship with the household. Each room you were admitted to was a degree closer to the inner life of the family. Each door represented a negotiation of trust. This system rooms, organized by levels of privacy and access, is essentially the logic of the modern home. The front room where you receive visitors, the kitchen where you admit close friends, the bedroom where almost no one comes uninvited. Medieval people invented that system. Not deliberately, not in one moment of architectural genius, but through a 200-year process of slowly, hesitantly, brick by brick, deciding that they were individuals who deserved a closed door. And now, with all of this in mind, the peasant's single room, where nothing was hidden, the lord's solar where the curtain became a wall, the merchant's house stacked with borrowed space, the garderobe where privacy and practicality met in the most honest room in the building, we're ready to look at the third great force that shaped the medieval home. The one nobody planned for. The one that arrived in ships from the east in the autumn of 1347 and changed everything, not over centuries but over months. What the Black Death did to medieval housing is a story so strange, so counterintuitive, and so unexpectedly hopeful in the middle of catastrophe that it deserves its own chapter entirely. And that chapter begins right now. Autumn 1347. Somewhere in the port of Messina on the island of Sicily, 12 trading ships have just arrived from the Black Sea. The dock workers who approach the vessels find something wrong almost immediately. Most of the sailors are dead. Those still alive are covered in dark swellings, oozing blood and pus in their armpits and their groins. Their skin carries strange black patches. Their breath comes in rattles. The port authorities ordered the ships out of harbour at once. It was already too late. I want to be careful with this part of our story. The Black Death is not a detail to be rushed through or used merely as dramatic backdrop. It was the single most catastrophic event in the history of medieval Europe, and possibly in the entire recorded history of humanity up to that point. Between 30 and 50% of Europe's population died between 1347 and 1351. Some regions lost more. The town of Givry in France recorded 28 funerals in a normal year. In the plague year of 1348, the local friar recorded 649 deaths. The city of Florence fell from perhaps 110,000 people to 50,000 in just 3 years. Over 60% of Norway's population perished. These are not numbers that the human mind processes easily. I have been reading about this period for years, and I still find myself stopping at those statistics and just sitting with them for a moment. 1 in 3, 1 in 2, gone. In England, where the disease arrived in the summer of 1348 at the small port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, carried on a ship from Bordeaux, the plague reached London by autumn and epidemic proportions by the end of September. The monk Henry of Knighton, writing in its aftermath, described the landscape of an entire country in shock. Many villages and hamlets have now become quite desolate. No one is left in the houses, for the people are dead that once inhabited them. Cattle wandered unclaimed across empty fields. Harvests rotted in the ground for lack of hands to bring them in. Whole villages, over 1,300 of them in England alone between 1350 and 1500, were simply abandoned, their buildings slowly collapsing back into the earth, their names eventually forgotten. Now, here is the question that I have been building toward, and it is the question that I think makes part 7 of our story so genuinely surprising. What did this catastrophe do to the homes of the people who survived? The answer is deeply counterintuitive. It is the kind of thing that makes you stop and reconsider your instinct about how the world works. The Black Death, the greatest single catastrophe in the history of the medieval world, produced for the people who lived through it a measurable improvement in where and how they lived. Not immediately, not everywhere equally, and not without enormous suffering in the process. I want to be very clear about that. But the economic chain of events that the plague set off led within a generation to something that centuries of moral arguments, peasant petitions and occasional uprisings had entirely failed to produce: better houses. Let me explain how this worked, because the mechanism is important and fascinating. Before 1348, the fundamental problem of the medieval peasant was simple and brutal. There were too many of them, and not enough land. Europe's population had grown steadily throughout the 12th and 13th centuries from roughly 35 million in the year 1000 to approximately 80 million by 1300. Every available acre was under cultivation. The lords knew it, and the peasants knew it. If you didn't like your lord's terms, your lord could find someone else willing to accept them. Labour was cheap precisely because there was so much of it. The Black Death ended that calculation overnight. In the immediate aftermath of the first outbreak, and it came in waves, with another devastating surge in 1361 that proved especially fatal to young men who had been born after the first wave and had no immunity, the surviving peasants found themselves in a position so economically strange that they barely knew what to do with it. There were not enough of them. Lords whose fields needed harvesting, whose animals needed tending, whose manors needed running were desperate. And desperation, as it always does, produced offers. Wages in England rose between 20 and 40% from the 1340s to the 1360s. In some specific cases, the increase was far more dramatic. At one Suffolk estate during the actual plague year of 1348 to 1349, the lord was paying 67% more per acre for reaping than he had paid the year before. 67% in a single year. The lords tried to stop it. Of course they did. In 1349, the English Parliament passed the Ordinance of Labourers, one of the most revealing pieces of legislation in medieval English history. It attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels by law. It declared that no peasant could leave the village they belonged to, and that no lord could pay more than wages had been in 1346. The law was, in the assessment of most historians, effectively unenforceable, because the market did not care about the Ordinance of Labourers. The market cared that there was more work than there were workers, and every time a lord tried to hold wages at the old rate, the labourer simply walked to the next village where a slightly more desperate lord was quietly offering more. Society became mobile in a way it had not been for centuries. People moved. People negotiated. People said no for the first time in the history of the feudal system and walked away. The chroniclers of the period are almost comically outraged about this. William Dean, writing in the Chronicle of Rochester Cathedral, described the peasants' new attitude with barely contained fury. The humble labourer was now demanding wages fit for his betters, he wrote, and was entirely unwilling to be told otherwise. What he was describing without understanding it was a labour market, the beginning of the end of serfdom. And now at last we get to the houses. Here is the specific architectural physical consequence of all of this economic upheaval. Peasants had money they had never had before. Not enormous wealth, not manor house wealth, but enough, just enough to make a choice that previous generations had never been able to make. They could build better. Historians and archaeologists have studied this period closely, and the evidence in the buildings themselves is striking. Pre-plague peasant houses, the ones that historians describe as constructed from fallen timber, mud and furs, built by families who could afford nothing else, were almost universally considered too insubstantial to survive more than a generation. After the plague, the picture changes. Archaeological study of the English Midlands, combining radiocarbon dating and tree ring analysis, has revealed that thousands of ordinary medieval homes still standing in English villages today were built in the period between roughly 1350 and 1450. Not manorial homes, not merchant houses, ordinary peasant dwellings built with good quality oak timber, properly jointed, designed to last. At Goldsoe in Lincolnshire, researchers found that peasant farmers could afford for the first time after the plague to build traditional longhouses in genuinely durable form using quality timber. These buildings were not grand, but they were solid. They were meant to be there in 100 years. A medieval peasant building a house that was meant to last 100 years was, architecturally speaking, making a statement about themselves that would have been unthinkable before 1348. Do you ever think about what it means to build something to last, I ask, because I think it is one of those questions that reveals a great deal about how people understand their own futures. When you build something flimsy, something you know will need replacing in 10 years, you're building for now, for this season, for this necessity. The future is too uncertain to invest in. When you build something to last, you're making a claim: I believe my children will be here. I believe this place will still matter in a generation. I believe I am worth the better timber. Before the Black Death, the average English peasant did not believe those things, not because they were unintelligent or unambitious, because the economics of their world gave them no reason to. Their labour was worth little. Their options were few. Their position was fixed. After the plague, something had shifted. Not permanently, not completely. The feudal structure reasserted itself in various ways over the following century, and some of the gains were lost. But in those decades immediately after the Great Dying in the Window, that one historian memorably called a golden interval, ordinary people built houses that have lasted 700 years. I find that genuinely moving, but the story of the plague and housing has another dimension that I want to spend a moment on because it is darker and stranger. The abandoned villages. Over 1,300 English villages were deserted between 1350 and 1500, and while the plague was not the only cause, enclosures' economic decline and climatic deterioration all played roles. The plague's depopulation was often the initial blow that set the abandonment in motion. Today, scattered across the English countryside, there are places you can visit carefully marked on Ordnance Survey maps as deserted medieval village sites where the ground rises and falls in subtle patterns that are not natural. Those gentle mounds and depressions are the ghost outlines of houses, streets, gardens, the imprint of a community in the earth itself. Archaeologists have excavated these sites with remarkable care, and what they find is often genuinely poignant. Everyday objects left behind in the rush of departure, or the gradual, desperate abandonment as household after household fell silent. Pottery, bones, the remnants of hearths that were never relit. One of the most extensively studied of these sites is Warham Percy in the Yorkshire Wolds, a village that was inhabited from the early medieval period and finally abandoned in the early 16th century. Excavations there over decades have produced an extraordinary picture of ordinary life and ordinary death, of houses rebuilt and rebuilt on the same footprints generation after generation, of a community that persisted through famine and plague and economic crisis before finally quietly giving up. Walking through Warham Percy today on a grey autumn morning, you can see the rectangular depressions in the grass where the houses stood. The ruined tower of the church still rises against the sky, and there is a particular quality of silence there, not the silence of a place that was never inhabited, but the silence of a place that was. The plague changed something else about medieval homes that I want to touch on briefly, because it concerns the very rich rather than the very poor. The architectural historian and medieval scholar Christopher Dyer has observed that the Black Death produced among the nobility a distinct shift in how they thought about their homes, specifically about display and elaboration. Before 1348, the great lords of England and France were in the middle of a period of extraordinary architectural ambition. Churches and cathedrals were being built in the elaborate ornate style that historians call decorated Gothic, flowing tracery, intricate stone carving, exuberant decoration. The same energy flowed into domestic building. After the plague, something cooled. The architectural style that replaced decorated Gothic was called perpendicular sharper, more austere planar. Part of this was economic wages had risen, building projects cost more. But part of it, historians argue, was something more psychological. A preoccupation with death, with the fragility of all things, with the futility of too much earthly display. When you have watched a third of the people you know die in 2 years, the impulse to spend 3 years carving elaborate stone foliage on a doorway perhaps diminishes somewhat. The homes built by the wealthy after the plague were still impressive, but there was a new sobriety about them, a new emphasis on usefulness, on warmth, on the actual comfort of being inside. Less theatre, more shelter. In a strange way, the Black Death pushed the entire spectrum of medieval housing from the poorest peasant's longhouse to the wealthiest lord's manor in the same direction, towards something more human, more honest, less about performance and more about actually living. The plague stripped away a great deal of the pretension of medieval domestic life on both ends of the social scale, and what was left was the irreducible core of what a home is supposed to be, a place where people stay alive, a place where people sleep and eat and hold each other, a place worth building from good timber, a place worth building to last. Now, all the parts of this story that we have told so far, the peasant's longhouse, the lord's hall, the merchant's jettied townhouse, the solar, the garderobe, the plague and its aftermath. All of these are the structures of medieval life, the containers. But what about what was actually inside them? What about the medieval kitchen, that dangerous, ingenious, smoke-filled engine of survival that fed the entire social order from the poorest peasant table to the lord's elaborate feast? Because the story of how medieval people actually cooked and ate in their homes and what that cooking space looked like and how it evolved and what extraordinary things happened inside it is one of the most sensory and surprising chapters we have left to tell, and it starts with a fire so large you could walk inside it. Of all the rooms we visited in this long journey through the medieval home, the smoky single room of the peasant, the great hall with its theatre of power, the solar with its closed door and its spy hole, none is more alive than the one I want to take you into now. The kitchen, not because it is the most beautiful, it is emphatically not the most beautiful. It is the most chaotic, the most dangerous, the loudest and the most honest room in the entire medieval home. It is the room that the Lord never visited and the servants never left. It is the room that fed everyone and was fed by no one, and it is the room where, if you wanted to understand how the medieval household actually worked, you needed to spend your time. So, let us go in. First, a question that will set up everything else I want to tell you. If you had to feed 50 to 100 people every single day from the Lord's family, down through the knights, the clerks, the ladies in waiting, the grooms, the stable hands, the boys who cleaned the boots with no refrigeration, no gas, no running water, and the only source of heat being open fire, where would you put the kitchen? Not in the main building. That is the answer that took medieval architects the better part of 3 centuries to arrive at, and it was the right one. Because fire in a building made largely of wood is not a cooking tool, it is a catastrophe waiting for the right moment. The kitchen at Kenilworth Castle in England, built largely by John of Gaunt in the second half of the 14th century, measures 66 feet by 28 feet. To give you a sense of scale, that is larger than many American houses. And it was a separate building connected to the Great Hall by a covered passageway specifically so that if the kitchen caught fire, which kitchens did with considerable regularity, the entire castle did not go up with it. The decision to separate the kitchen was not only practical, it was also social. It removed the noise, the heat, the smell of cooking from the spaces where the lord and his household were meant to be comfortable and impressive. Servants carried food from kitchen to hall up stone staircases built specifically for the purpose, invisible and efficient, so that dishes appeared on the lord's table as if by magic. The kitchen was the engine room of the castle, and like all engine rooms, nobody who benefited from it wanted to think too carefully about what went on inside. Step inside for a moment and let your eyes adjust. The first thing you see is fire. Not a single fire, multiple fires burning in hearths so large that several men could stand inside them and not touch the walls. The hearth at Castelnau-la-Chapelle in France, a castle dating to the 12th century, still exists. I have seen photographs of it. The logs stacked inside it are the size of tree trunks. This is not a fireplace designed for warmth. This is a fireplace designed to roast a whole animal, several animals simultaneously, and keep them rotating for hours, because the spit had to turn. This is the detail that always gets me when I think about medieval cooking. The spit, that long iron rod skewering a joint of meat or an entire bird, or, in the case of a great feast, something much larger, had to be turned continuously for the entire duration of cooking. Continuously, without stopping. Because uneven heat meant uneven cooking, and meat that sat still against the fire would char on one side and remain raw on the other. Someone had to turn that spit by hand hour after hour in front of a fire hot enough to cook an ox. That someone was a spit boy. The spit boys were, as their name suggests, usually boys, often sons of local village families placed in the castle kitchen, from around the age of 10 or 12 as the lowest rung of the kitchen hierarchy. Their work was exactly what it sounds like. They sat or crouched beside the hearth, gripping the handle of the spit, and they turned it, and turned it, and turned it, for hours. The heat was extraordinary. The noise, the crackling fat, the spitting embers, the shouts of the master cook above the general din was constant. And the spit boy's hands, after a season in that kitchen, were calloused and scarred in ways that told their own story. At Raby Castle in England, the original kitchen still survives in remarkable condition, and its records note that the cooking was originally done on 4 open fires, with meat roasted on spits turned by small boys, or in a detail that might be the most medieval thing I've ever encountered, by dogs on treadmill wheels. Dogs bred specifically for this purpose, walking perpetually on a wheel mounted beside the hearth, their movement mechanically translated into the rotation of the spit. I genuinely cannot decide whether that is ingenious or disturbing. Perhaps both. Probably both. Now the spit boys occupied the very bottom of the kitchen hierarchy. But the kitchen hierarchy itself was a fascinating thing, a social pyramid in miniature that mirrored the broader structure of the castle with almost perfect fidelity. At the top was the master cook. Not a servant in the ordinary sense, a figure of genuine authority, sometimes holding a position of rank roughly equivalent to a senior household official. The master cook at a great castle might oversee dozens of subordinates. He was responsible not just for the food, but for the organization, timing and presentation of every meal. He commanded the roasting cook who managed the spits and the fires, the sauce cook whose domain was the complex expensive, spice-heavy condiments that defined fine medieval cuisine. The pastry cook who produced the elaborate baked constructions, the pies and pastels and subtleties that appeared at the end of great feasts, and the bakers who worked in their own separate bakehouse, rising before dawn every day to produce the bread that was the foundation of every meal at every social level. Below all of these were the scullions, the lowest of the low, whose duties were the endless, thankless work of washing, scrubbing, carrying water, disposing of waste and cleaning the surfaces on which everyone else worked. The scullion of a large medieval castle might spend their entire waking day carrying water from the well, emptying it into cauldrons, emptying cauldrons of waste and starting again. And below the scullions, in a category almost beyond formal rank, were the kitchen boys, the ones at the fire. Here is something I want to ask you directly because I think it changes how you experience this. Do you have a room in your home where you do most of the living? Not the room that looks most impressive, not the room you clean before guests arrive, the room that actually holds your day, your coffee cup, your half-finished projects, the mess that tells the true story of how you spend your time. Every home has that room. The room that is the real heart of the house as opposed to the decorative heart. In the medieval home, that room was always the kitchen, or in the peasant's case, the single room where the fire burned which served the same purpose. The kitchen was where decisions were made, where the actual management of the household happened, where the rhythms of the day were set. The lord might hold court in the great hall, but the castle ran from the kitchen. I find something genuinely profound about that. The room with the most power was not the most impressive room. The most important work was done by the people who are never seen. Now let us talk about something that almost every person who encounters medieval history gets wrong. Not because they are careless, because the myth is too good, too satisfying, and too well established to be easily dislodged. The myth that medieval people drank ale instead of water because the water was too dangerous to drink. You have probably heard this. It is stated as fact in countless popular history books, and it has a seductive logic. No modern plumbing, open cesspits, rivers running through cities carrying everything imaginable. Of course, the water was unsafe. Of course, everyone drank ale. The reality is considerably more nuanced, and the scholars who have studied it most carefully using grain production records, household accounts, and literary sources from the period have come to a rather different conclusion. Medieval people drank water, not always, not exclusively, but regularly and often preferentially. The historian Martin Cornell, who has spent decades analysing medieval drinking records, took the actual grain production figures of England and calculated how much ale they could have produced. His conclusion, working from the numbers, was that the total grain available for brewing could have supplied each adult with roughly a third of a pint of ale per day. Not gallons, not even a full pint, a third of a pint. People who were working in the fields in summer heat burning 3,000 calories a day could not have been sustained on a third of a pint of anything. They were drinking water. From wells, from rivers, from collected rainwater, and they knew perfectly well that clear, cold, fast-running water was safe, while standing water downriver from a settlement was not. Medieval people were not ignorant about water quality. They simply lacked the scientific vocabulary to explain what they knew empirically, that some water made you sick and some water did not. What ale actually provided, and this is the real story, the more interesting story, was calories and nutrition. Small ale, the low-alcohol everyday drink that most people consumed, was essentially a liquid grain supplement. Calorie-dense, slightly nutritious, and brewed fresh locally by someone in almost every household in medieval England. That someone was overwhelmingly a woman. The brewing of ale in medieval England was not the domain of professional brewers operating large commercial enterprises. It was domestic, it was seasonal, and it was women's work not in a diminishing sense but in the sense that it was skilled economically significant labour, performed primarily by women within the household economy. These women were called alewives or brewsters, and the 10th century text known as Elfric's Colloquy, an imagined dialogue between a teacher and his students, captures the casual familiarity of this arrangement perfectly. One young man is asked what he drinks, and his response is simple and practical. I drink ale usually if I drink at all, and water if I have no ale. Water if I have no ale. Not water is dangerous and I avoid it. Simply ale when available, water when not. The alewife brewed in the home using the same hearth that cooked the food, the same fire, the same iron cauldrons. She malted her barley, added whatever herbs she had available, hyssop heather, yarrow bog myrtle, and produced a thick, cloudy, mildly alcoholic drink that went off within a few days and had to be constantly replenished. A bushy branch hung over the door of a house that had fresh ale for sale, and neighbours came to buy it. Medieval ale was not what you're imagining when I say the word ale. It was more like a thin, slightly fermented grain porridge, cloudy, perishable, low in alcohol. One person in the 13th century described it in what I consider one of history's most committed bad reviews as muddy, foul, fulsome puddle stinking. And yet it was central to the daily economy of the medieval home, produced within that home by the people who ran that home using the same fire that cooked everything else. The medieval kitchen in all its forms, from the lord's great separate building with its enormous hearths, to the peasant's single room where everything happened at once, was not simply a room for preparing food. It was a room for surviving, for producing, preserving, managing and distributing the resources that kept every person in the household alive through the seasons, through the cold, through the endless cycle of needing to eat again tomorrow and the day after. And the people who did that work the master cook and the scullion and the spit boy and the alewife and the baker, who rose before dawn. They were the invisible centre of the medieval world, the people whose labour made everyone else's life possible. When I think about the medieval home, I keep coming back to those kitchens, to the fire that was always burning, to the spit that was always turning, to the hands that were always working, always serving, always just out of sight around the corner from the hall where the Lord sat in his great chair and received his guests. The home ran from the kitchen. It always has. Now we've been moving through the medieval home from the outside in walls and floors, great halls and private chambers, kitchens and hearths. But there is still a dimension of this story we've not yet entered, the spiritual dimension. Because for the people who lived in these homes, every single one of them, from the lord to the spit boy, the house was not just a physical structure, it was a cosmological one. Every corner of the medieval home carried religious meaning. Every threshold had its saint. Every hearth had its prayer. The church was not simply where you went on Sunday. It was woven into the architecture of daily life in ways that are genuinely difficult for modern minds to grasp. And understanding that dimension, the sacred geography of the medieval home, changes how you see everything else we've talked about tonight. That is exactly where we are going next. Somewhere between the kitchen we just left and the street outside, there is a doorstep. And on that doorstep, something invisible happens every time a medieval person crosses it. Not metaphorically invisible, literally invisible, a blessing, a prayer, a gesture so habitual and so deeply embedded in the fabric of daily life that it required no announcement, no ceremony, no conscious thought. You crossed the threshold of your home, and you were in a different kind of space. The threshold in the medieval world was not simply the boundary between indoors and outdoors. It was the boundary between the world as it was and the world as it ought to be, between the unpredictable, fallen, morally complicated exterior and the household as a little order carved out of the larger chaos. And that threshold in many medieval homes was literally marked. Crosses cut into the doorframe, holy water kept just inside the entrance, a small image of a saint mounted above the door where everyone entering would see it. Let me tell you what that actually meant and why understanding it changes everything about how we read the medieval home. Here is a question worth pausing on because I think it opens something up. When you walk into your own home tonight, what do you feel? Relief, probably. Safety, maybe. The particular quality of quiet or warmth that means you are in your place. But underneath those immediate feelings, what does the space mean to you? For most modern people, the answer is something like it means comfort, privacy, a space I control where I can be myself. For a medieval person, the answer was something incomparably larger. The home was not simply a private space, it was a moral geography, a cosmological statement, a small universe in which God's presence was meant to be felt as immediately and as tangibly as in the village church, as long as the household was arranged correctly, prayed correctly, observed the right days, kept the right objects in the right places. The scholar Caroline Walker Bynum, one of the most distinguished historians of medieval religious life, wrote that in the medieval period spirituality was not confined to religious institutions, but seeped into the fabric of everyday existence. Not trickled, seeped. The way water seeps through stone, finding every crack, filling every space it can reach. That is the domestic religious world of the Middle Ages, and it looked very different from anything we would recognize. Begin with the most powerful sacred object in the average peasant home. Not a Bible. Almost no peasant owned a Bible. Books were extraordinarily expensive. A single handwritten manuscript might cost the equivalent of years of labor, and most peasants could not read anyway. The sacred object was the crucifix. A small painted or carved image of Christ kept above the hearth or near the bed, the most prominent wall of the single room. And that crucifix was not decorative. It was functional in the fullest theological sense. It was the point of the room's devotional focus, the axis around which the household's spiritual life organized itself. In wealthier homes, particularly by the 13th and 14th centuries, this devotional corner became more elaborate. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection of medieval religious objects includes some of the small diptychs, portable altarpieces and ivory prayer pieces that wealthy individuals kept in their private chambers, folding panels small enough to hold in two hands that open to reveal painted scenes of the Nativity, or the Crucifixion, or the Virgin Mary. When Giovanni Morelli, a 14th century Florentine merchant, described his private prayer practice, he wrote about kneeling barefoot in his nightgown before a painted crucifix in his bedchamber, kissing the figures making the sign of the cross. This was not unusual. This was normal. The bedchamber was not a secular space. It was by the theological understanding of the time a primary site of private devotion, the place where the individual soul came face to face with the sacred in its most intimate form, away from the public ceremony of the church in the vulnerability and quiet of personal prayer. Now let us move from the individual object to the community space, from the private prayer of the merchant to the collective religious geography of the entire village. Because the medieval village viewed from above was not organized primarily around economics or defense or agricultural efficiency. It was organized around the church, physically, literally, architecturally organized around the church. In most English villages, the church was one of only two stone buildings, the church, and if the community was large enough, the manor house. Every other structure was timber and thatch, wattle and daub, built of materials that would eventually decay and return to the earth. But the church was stone. It was built to last beyond any individual life, beyond any generation, perhaps beyond the world itself. And this distinction between the impermanent homes of the living and the permanent stone of the church was not accidental. It was theological. The church was the one building in the village that was not primarily for this life. It was a building for eternity, anchoring the community to something that endured beyond the brief span of any single person's years. The churchyard surrounding it contained the dead, grandparents, great-grandparents, The entire chain of ancestors who had worked these fields, slept in these homes, breathed this air. The living and the dead coexisted in the medieval village in a physical immediacy that we have entirely lost. You walked past the graves of your family on your way to morning mass. The dead were not absent. They were present on the other side of a low stone wall waiting, and the church that stood above those graves was also where you went to settle disputes, to hear the news of the wider world from the priest's Sunday sermon, to meet your neighbours, to celebrate the feast days that punctuated the agricultural year. It was courthouse and assembly hall and theatre and community centre and house of God all in one building every week of your life. Let me tell you something about those feast days, because I think they are one of the things that modern people most consistently underestimate about medieval life. The medieval calendar was not our calendar. It was a liturgical calendar, a year organised not by months and weeks, but by the rhythm of the church's observances, and that calendar was extraordinarily busy. In medieval England, the number of obligatory feast days when you were not supposed to work, when you were required to attend church, when the village came together for celebration or solemn observance, was somewhere between 40 and 60 per year, depending on the region and the specific parish. 40 to 60 days of rest and celebration, in addition to Sundays. Think about that for a moment. The medieval peasant is often imagined as someone who worked without rest from dawn to dark every day of the year. But the liturgical calendar built in a remarkable amount of communal time for the village to gather, for the community to recognize itself as a community, for the relationship between labor and rest, and sacred time to be visibly maintained. The great feasts, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost. The major saints' days were not simply religious observances, they were the social events of the year. The points on the calendar when ordinary rules were suspended, when extra food was available, when the Lord might distribute alms or host a feast for his dependents, when the churchyard might host music and dancing. The living and the dead, the sacred and the secular, the lord and the peasant brought together at the same moment in the same space by the same calendar. Now I want to bring the religious dimension back inside the home, because there is a dimension of domestic faith in the medieval world that I find particularly beautiful and particularly forgotten. The stable, not as a metaphor, as a literal building. In the medieval theological imagination, the stable was not a lowly, embarrassing place. It was one of the most sacred in the created world, because God had chosen to be born in one. St. Francis of Assisi in the year 1223 staged what is considered the first live nativity scene, a reenactment of the birth of Christ in a real stable with real animals in the town of Greccio in Italy. His biographer St. Bonaventure described Francis kneeling in the straw beside a manger, his eyes full of tears. For Francis, and for the medieval Christian imagination broadly, the stable was not a humble setting that God graciously condescended to inhabit. It was a dignified setting, a fitting setting, a setting that said something important, that the sacred was not confined to marble churches and painted ceilings. It was present in the straw, in the breath of animals, in the cold and the dark and the smell of the barn. And this theology had direct implications for the medieval home, because many medieval homes shared space with animals either in the longhouse arrangement we talked about in Part 3, or in the barn immediately adjacent to the dwelling, or in the lower floor of the merchant's house where the workshop was. Animals were not kept at a distance from the domestic sacred. They were woven into it. The pig sleeping by the hearth was not an intrusion into the household spiritual order. It was in some theologically serious sense entirely at home there. Let me tell you about one more dimension of the sacred household that has largely vanished from the modern world, the chapel. For the noble family of any significance, the household chapel was not an optional addition to the manor house or the castle. It was essential, a necessity. Because the noble household had its own resident chaplain, A priest who lived with the family celebrated Mass daily in the chapel, heard confession, administered the sacraments, and prayed without ceasing for the spiritual welfare of the Lord and his household. This arrangement was called the household chaplaincy, and it meant that the sacred was woven into the daily schedule of the noble home in the most literal possible way. Morning Mass before the day began, evening prayers when it ended, the chapel bells marking the canonical hours, the 7 designated times of prayer that the rule of St. Benedict had instituted for monasteries, and that in various simplified forms filtered into the observance of devout lay people. The castle chapel at Sainte-Chapelle in the Château de Vincennes in France, built in the 14th century, has windows and vaulted ceilings that rival the great urban churches of the period. It was not built as a small private room. It was built as a statement that even within the walls of a military fortress, beauty and devotion were the first priority, and in humbler households where a full chapel was beyond the means of the family, there was still the private altar. The corner of the sola or the bedchamber with its saint's image, its candle, its small vessel of holy water. The place where the family gathered at the end of the day to say the prayers that were not optional, not ceremonial, but the actual working mechanism by which they believed their souls were sustained and protected through the night. Here is what I find myself thinking about when I try to hold all of this together. The medieval home was, in a way, we have almost entirely lost a home built to contain not just human bodies, but human souls. Everything in it was oriented toward the question of what a person owed to God, to their community, and to the generations of dead who lay in the churchyard just outside the village. The house was not simply a shelter from the elements. It was a practice, a daily physical practice of belonging to something larger than the individual self. And here is the paradox I keep turning over. We have more private space than any medieval person ever dreamed of. More comfort, more warmth, more light, more things. Our homes are incomparably better by every material measure, and yet there is something in the medieval domestic world, that sense of the house, as a cosmological space, as a place where the sacred and the ordinary were not merely adjacent but thoroughly, inextricably mixed, that we have genuinely completely lost. I'm not sure we should want it back exactly. I'm sure that the loss is real. Now we have been tracing the story of the medieval home from its walls outward and its spirit inward. But there is still one corner of this story we have not yet entered, and it is perhaps the most architecturally dramatic transformation in the entire 1,000-year history we have been telling. The question of what changed when Europe began to build differently. When the great variety of medieval housing traditions, the peasant's longhouse, the merchant's jettied townhouse, the lord's manor with its great hall and solar and chapel, began to coalesce into something new. When the idea of the home as we recognize it today, with its separate rooms, its personal spaces, its deliberate separation of kitchen from living room and bedroom from hall, first came into clear focus. That story begins with a building technique that most people have never heard of in a region of Europe, that most people associate with something else entirely. And it changed everything. Somewhere in the German-speaking lands in the broad fertile territory between the Alps and the North Sea, sometime in the early part of the 13th century, someone built something that would change the way Europeans lived indoors forever. Not a castle, not a cathedral, not a palace, a stove. Specifically a new kind of stove, an enclosed ceramic box set into a wall fired from an adjacent room so that the smoke never entered the space it heated. The firebox and its fumes stayed in the kitchen. The warmth radiated out through thick glazed tiles into the room next door, a room where there was no smoke, no ash drifting through the air, no eyes watering, no permanent layer of soot blackening every surface. Just clean, steady, radiant warmth for hours after the fire had burned down to embers. For most of European history, this had been an impossible luxury, and now quietly in a region most of us associate more with beer and Christmas markets than with revolutionary domestic technology. It was real. Let me tell you why this matters so much, because it is easy to hear a new kind of stove and not feel the full weight of what that meant. Go back to everything we've talked about in this video. The peasant's single room filled with the smoke of the central fire, the great hall of the Lord's manor where the hearth in the middle of the floor sent smoke billowing into the rafters before it slowly escaped through a hole in the roof, the merchant's townhouse in Southampton where the Flemish chimney we mentioned was already an improvement over what came before. In all of those spaces, in every home we've visited tonight, from the 12th century longhouse to the 14th century solar, the relationship between fire and smoke was a given. You wanted warmth, you got smoke. You cooked your food, you blackened your walls. You kept your family alive through the winter. You irritated your lungs every single day. This was simply what fire meant. The German Kachelofen, the tiled stove, broke that equation at its root. And it did it with an elegance so simple that it seems almost obvious in retrospect. The stove's firebox opened into the kitchen, where smoke and heat were already expected. The stove's radiating body protruded through the wall into the living room, the Stube, where families could now sit, work, sleep, and raise their children in genuine warmth without the smoke. The Stube. That German word, which eventually gave English the word stove, originally meant the heated room itself, not the device. The room, the very concept of a warm, clean, dedicated living room, was so new that it needed its own word. A French traveller named Gilles de Bouvier, writing in the middle of the 15th century, described what he saw when he crossed into German-speaking Europe with a kind of barely concealed astonishment. He noted that German people had stoves that heated their rooms so well that they were warm indoors, and that in winter craftsmen did their work and kept their wives and children in these spaces, and that it took very little wood to heat them. Very little wood. For a French observer from a country where entire forests were being consumed by open fireplaces that wasted most of their heat up enormous chimneys, this was extraordinary. The tiled stove was roughly 3 to 4 times more efficient than an open fire. It held its heat for 6 to 12 hours after the fire went out. It could keep a room comfortable through a winter night on a fraction of the fuel that English and French households were burning. And the tiles themselves here is where the German innovation became an art form. Archaeologists have found thousands of decorative stove tiles from 14th and 15th century urban sites across Germany, Bohemia, Poland, and Hungary. These were not simple functional objects. They were status symbols, glazed in rich greens, yellows, blues, decorated with heraldic shields, with biblical scenes, with hunting imagery, with geometric patterns of extraordinary intricacy. A well-made Kachelofen in a prosperous burgher's home was as much a statement of taste and wealth as a tapestry in a manor house. The most beautiful stoves were covered in relief-moulded tiles depicting knights and saints and classical figures. When the fire behind the tiles heated them to their working temperature, the ceramic surfaces seemed almost to glow from within. Think about sitting across the room from something like that on a cold January evening, warm, dry, smoke-free, surrounded by glowing tiles, compared to the experience of crouching over a central hearth in a haze of smoke, your eyes streaming your clothes permanently smelling of soot. The Stube was genuinely revolutionary. It was the first time in medieval European domestic history that an ordinary person could experience what we would now call a comfortable room. Now, can I ask you something? Have you ever sat in front of a fireplace and noticed how uneven the warmth is, how your face is hot and your back is cold, and you keep rotating slightly to even things out? That is the fundamental problem of heating by open fire. It radiates in one direction. It heats what is close and ignores what is far. It demands proximity and gives nothing to the room as a whole. The cachalofen heated the entire room, evenly, steadily, without requiring you to sit 2 feet from the wall to feel it. And this single change from the experience of clustered warmth around a central fire to the experience of whole room warmth from a radiant stove had architectural consequences that took generations to work through. Because once you had a warm room, you could furnish it differently. You could place chairs away from the wall. You could light the space with candles, not because they were near the fire, but because the light was needed for the work being done embroidery, accounting, reading. You could eventually have glazed windows without the room becoming unbearable in winter. The tiled stove and the glazed window arriving in the same century gave people something that had never existed in the medieval home, a room you wanted to be in. Not a room you had to be in because it was the only warm space. A room designed for the experience of being indoors, comfortable, lit, functional, pleasant. That is a genuinely new idea. But while the cachalofen was transforming domestic interiors across Central Europe, something equally dramatic was happening in England through a completely different set of mechanisms. The historian William George Hoskins, writing in the 1950s, identified a phenomenon so striking that he gave it a capital letter name, the Great Rebuilding. Roughly between the 1570s and the 1640s, a span of about 70 years, thousands of English houses were rebuilt, upgraded, or fundamentally transformed. Not by the wealthy, not by the nobility, by ordinary people. Yeomen, husbandmen, the moderately prosperous farming families who had benefited from the economic changes that followed the Black Death, and who by the late 16th century had enough accumulated wealth to make a choice that their grandparents had never been able to make. They could build properly, and what they built tells us exactly what they had been waiting for. Here is Anne Hathaway's cottage in the village of Shottery in Warwickshire, England, the famous childhood home of the woman who married William Shakespeare. The original structure, bought by one John Hathaway in 1543, was what historians call a 2-cell building. A door into a passage, a kitchen to one side, a hall structure to the other, with what one architectural historian delightfully described as an hole in the roof to let out the smoke from the central hearth. No chimney, no upper floor properly divided into private rooms, no glazed windows, standard medieval. Then around 1610 the larger section of the cottage was added, and the whole building was transformed. 2 proper floors, a staircase, a brick chimney, glazed windows. The historian describing this transformation cannot quite contain his enthusiasm. He writes about these additions as the luxury, practically putting the word in quotation marks with an exclamation point, and I understand exactly why. Because if you had spent your life in a house where smoke filled the room and wind came through unglazed windows, and the only way upstairs was a ladder, then a proper staircase, and a chimney, and glass, actual glass, were not small improvements. They were a different way of being indoors. The changes that define the Great Rebuilding, when you list them, seem mundane. The chimney moving the fire from the centre of the floor to the wall, eliminating the permanent smoke and crucially freeing up the space above. Because once the fire was against the wall and the smoke went upward through a proper flue, the ceiling above the old central hearth hall could be lowered. A floor could be inserted. A proper upper story created not a loft reached by a ladder, but a room with headroom with its own fireplace connected to the main chimney stack with privacy. The newel staircase replacing the ladder, the parlour appearing as a dedicated room for receiving guests, the glazed window letting in light without letting in cold. Each of these changes is individually modest. Taken together, they created something that had never existed in the ordinary English home. Private rooms dedicated to specific purposes, connected by stairs rather than ladders, lit by glass, heated by a proper chimney. The floor plan of the modern house. And here is the thing I find most moving about the Great Rebuilding, and it is the thing that Hoskins himself emphasizes most strongly in his original paper. These buildings were not built by the nobility. The aristocracy had been building comfortably for generations. They had already had their solar and their garderobe and their separate kitchen, and their glazed windows since the 13th and 14th centuries. The Great Rebuilding was the moment when the people further down the ladder, the yeomen, the husbandmen, the craftsmen, the middling sort, finally got to make the same choices. It was a democratization of comfort, and the reason they could finally afford it in the 1500s that they could not afford in the 1300s comes back in part to a story we've already told in this video: the Black Death. The slow, painful, extraordinary chain of economic consequences that followed the Great Dying of 1348. The labour shortage, the rising wages, the new mobility, the emerging yeoman class who accumulated land in the wake of the plague, that chain of events unfolding over 2 centuries eventually produced families with enough accumulated wealth to do something entirely ordinary. Build a house they were proud of, a house that said, not, I am surviving, but I am here, I am comfortable, I am permanent. That transition from the medieval home as a survival structure to the early modern home as an expression of comfort and identity is one of the most underappreciated shifts in the entire history of domestic life. And it began in the smoke, in the peasant's single room where everything happened around the fire that was never allowed to go out, in the Lord's great hall where the smoke rose through the roof and the rushes on the floor collected everything that fell, in the merchant's townhouse where the undercroft stored wine and the upper rooms overhung the street. All of those spaces, all of that smoke and darkness and cold were not mistakes waiting to be corrected. They were stages in a very long journey towards something specific, a home that a person could not just inhabit but inhabit well. Now, we've arrived at the threshold of something. We have walked through 1,000 years of medieval housing, from the first timber longhouse to the smoke-free stuba, from the peasant's wattle and daub walls to the yeoman's glazed windows. We have seen how people lived, who they shared their roofs with, how they slept and cooked and prayed and rebuilt after catastrophe. And I have been saving one thing, the question that for me sits underneath all of this history and gives it its deepest resonance. Not what these homes looked like. We know that now. But what they meant. What it means and has always meant for a human being to come inside, to close a door, to be home. That is where we're going in the final parts of this journey. And it might just be the most important thing we've talked about all night. You know what bothers me about almost every medieval movie ever made? Not the historical inaccuracies, not the anachronistic music or the improbably clean costumes, not even the torches burning unnecessarily in bright daylight, though that one does make every historian quietly weep a little. What bothers me is something subtler. It is the way they make medieval people feel distant, like aliens, like a different species, like being so removed from our own experience that we could never truly understand them, only observe them from a safe cinematic distance. And after everything we have walked through together tonight, the longhouse and the great hall, the merchant's jettied townhouse and the solar with its squint hole, the kitchen fire and the alewife and the spit boy and the plague-changed village, I want to tell you something. Medieval people were not alien. They were us. In different clothes, in different buildings, under different skies, but driven by the same things that drive us now. The need to be warm, the need to be fed, the need to belong somewhere, the need to close a door and be for just a moment in a place that was theirs. Let me start part 11 with a challenge to one of the most stubbornly persistent myths about the Middle Ages. A myth that shapes almost every popular depiction of the period, from the most earnest period drama to the most irreverent comedy sketch. The myth of the Dark Ages, The idea that the 1,000 years between roughly the 5th and the 15th centuries were a period of intellectual stagnation, cultural decay and unrelieved misery, a long parenthesis between the glory of Rome and the glory of the Renaissance during which nothing particularly important happened and ordinary people simply suffered and died. This myth was invented, not gradually, not through accumulated misunderstanding. It was invented with remarkable specificity by a single 14th century Italian poet named Petrarch. He looked back at the Roman era as a golden age, looked at his own present as a period of darkness by comparison, and wrote with all the authority of a genuine literary genius that history was divided into two great phases: the shining classical period followed by a darkness in which he believed himself to be living. The Renaissance thinkers who followed him, hungry for legitimacy and originality, found the framework irresistible. The 19th century romantics who loved a good dramatic narrative arc did not discourage it. Hollywood, which needed recognizable shorthand, embraced it completely. And so the Dark Ages became a cultural fixture, an era of filth, ignorance and brutality that made the modern world look brilliantly accomplished by comparison. Here is what is actually true. The medieval period produced the Gothic cathedral, one of the most technically demanding and aesthetically overwhelming architectural achievements in human history. It produced Dante Chaucer, Christine de Pizan. It produced the university, a form of intellectual institution that is still the dominant model worldwide. It produced the common law tradition that underlies the legal systems of most English-speaking nations. It produced sophisticated music, illuminated manuscripts of almost impossible beauty, philosophy, theology, and poetry of genuine depth and power. And it produced something that we've been exploring all night, a tradition of domestic architecture that, when you actually look at it carefully, reveals minds of extraordinary ingenuity, solving extraordinarily difficult problems with ingenuity, care, and skill. These were not dark ages. They were different ages, different in ways that are fascinating, genuinely challenging, and sometimes uncomfortable, but not dark. Now here is the specific misconception I want to address most directly, because it is the one most relevant to everything we've talked about tonight. The widespread belief that medieval people, and especially medieval peasants, were somehow passive, that they simply accepted whatever circumstances produced the smoke, the cold, the dirt, the communal sleeping arrangements, the absence of privacy, without preference, without creativity, without genuine human longing for something better. You have seen enough tonight to know that this is wrong. You have seen the medieval peasant building his longhouse in a way that was clearly thought through, using the heat of cattle, orienting the building, managing the smoke as best the technology allowed. Not because he was primitive, because he was working with what he had and doing it with intelligence. You have seen the Lord's wife advocating for the solar, that small private room above the great hall, because she wanted genuinely and specifically a space that was quiet and hers. Not because privacy is a modern concept, because the desire for it is human, and it found its expression in the architecture when the resources became available. You have seen the merchant in Southampton building his undercroft for wine, and his jettied upper floor integrating his commerce and his family life in a single, ingenious, narrow house, not because he was willing to accept any arrangement, but because he was solving problems creatively under tight constraints. You have seen, even in the terrible aftermath of the Black Death, ordinary people choosing to build with better timber and more permanent structures, choosing for the first time to build as if the future was worth investing in. None of that is passivity. All of it is aspiration. There is a question I want to put to you directly, because I think it is the most illuminating question in all of medieval domestic history. What did the medieval home contain that the modern home has largely lost? Not what did it lack. We know what it lacked. Plumbing, insulation, electricity, refrigeration, glass in the windows, proper floors, privacy in any meaningful modern sense. But what did it have that we no longer have? The historian Jeremy Goldberg, in his remarkable study of domestic life in medieval York, describes the medieval home as a space of labour identity and human drama. His words are worth sitting with for a moment. Labour, identity, human drama. The medieval home was a workplace in a way the modern home simply is not. The tailor sewed in his hall. The goldsmith worked his metals in the same space where his children played and his wife brewed ale. The farmer's wife processed dairy and preserved food in rooms that were directly continuous with the rooms where the family slept. There was no separation between the productive life of the household and its domestic life, because there was no conceptual distinction between the two. Your work was your home. Your home was your work. They were the same thing, an identity. The medieval home was not simply a shelter or a personal retreat. It was a public statement about who you were in the social fabric of your community. The size of your house, the materials it is made from how it sat in relation to the Lord's manor and the village church, all of this was legible to everyone around you. You could not hide what you were in the medieval village. The architecture made it visible. And human drama. Because the medieval home was so thoroughly shared with family members of all generations, with servants, with apprentices, with animals, with neighbours who came and went, it was a space of constant, unavoidable human interaction. Nothing was private. Everything was witnessed. And witnessing in a community where reputation was everything and social bonds were the primary safety net was not intrusion. It was participation. Here is something that I genuinely believe after spending a long time with this material. We've gained enormous things by separating ourselves from the medieval model of home. The private bedroom, the individual bathroom, the separate kitchen, the room that is yours alone where you can close the door and exist without audience. The freedom from the smoke and the smell and the cold. The freedom from the knowledge that your neighbours can hear every word you speak. We have gained all of this, and it is good, really good. But we have also lost something real. The medieval household, for all its genuine hardships, for all the things I would never want to actually experience, was embedded in a web of relationship and mutual obligation that gave it a depth of meaning that our modern, more private homes often struggle to produce. When you lived in a world where everyone heard your arguments and your prayers and your laughter and your grief, you were never alone with your sorrows in the particular sealed way that modern solitude sometimes produces. When the fire that heated your room was the same fire that cooked your food, and that your neighbours came to for warmth in an emergency, the hearth was not just a source of heat. It was a symbol of everything the household offered to everyone who approached it. When the threshold of your home was marked with a blessing, and your wall held a saint's image, and your calendar was the liturgical calendar of the whole community, you were not simply a private individual in a private space. You were part of something that extended beyond you in every direction backward through the ancestors in the churchyard and forward into a future you could not see. I am not saying this was comfortable. Much of it was deeply uncomfortable. I am saying it was meaningful in a specific, irreplaceable way. And this brings me to the thing that I find most striking about the entire history of the medieval home. The thing that when I sit quietly with it feels most important. Medieval people lived surrounded by evidence of their own impermanence. The walls of their houses were made of organic materials that would return to the earth within decades if not maintained. The bones of their dead were literally under their feet in the churchyard. The plague could arrive in a ship from a distant port and kill half of everyone they knew within 2 years. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed perhaps 10 to 15% of Europe's population in less than 3 years. In the face of all of that, in the face of an impermanence that was not philosophical but immediate and physical, Medieval people still built homes, still planted gardens, still commissioned painted tiles for their stoves and tapestries for their walls, still inscribed their maker's marks on the beams of houses they were building for strangers they would never know. There is something in that insistence on building, on creating, on making a home in the face of everything that made homemaking provisional and uncertain, something that I find genuinely moving, not despite the hardship. Because of it, the act of making a home was for a medieval person not a comfort. It was a declaration. It said, I believe this place will still be here. I believe someone will need to live well in it. I believe that the effort of building something good and solid and warm is worth it even in a world where everything is fragile. And perhaps here is my own opinion offered with the appropriate humility. Perhaps that is the most important thing the medieval home can teach us today. Not the architectural details, not the wattle and daub technique or the tiled stove or the solar with its squint hole. Those are fascinating, but they are not the point. The point is that generation after generation of people in circumstances incomparably harder than ours chose to make their homes beautiful within whatever constraints they faced, chose to hang tapestries and mark thresholds with blessings and plant the herbs that made the floor smell good at Easter, chose to put the best bed in the solar and leave it to the next person in the will, chose to build in oak rather than elm because oak would last. They built as if the future mattered. They built as if the people who came after them deserved something worth inheriting. And 700 years later you can still stand in the soot-blackened rafters of a cruck house in the English Midlands and see the carpenter's marks on the beams. Someone cut those marks. Someone built that house. Someone was home there. Now, as we come toward the close of this journey, there is one last thing I want to do with you. I want to take everything we have walked through tonight, the longhouse and the great hall, the merchant's townhouse, and the plague-changed village, the kitchen fire, and the tiled stove, and the great rebuilding, and hold it up against the single most fundamental question about the medieval home. What did coming inside mean? What happened across 1,000 years of European history when a person crossed that threshold, pulled the door closed against the dark and stood for a moment in the space that was theirs? That question has an answer. A real, historically grounded answer. And it is the most beautiful answer in everything we have talked about tonight. The word hearth. Say it slowly for a moment. Hearth. In Old English, the word is hearth. It shares an ancient root stretching back through the Indo-European languages to a word meaning burning heat fire. But what is remarkable is what it came to mean beyond the physical object. Because in almost every European language, in almost every culture that built homes around a fire, the word for the fireplace eventually became a synonym for home itself, hearth and home. Keep the home fires burning, a family hearth. The fire was so central, so absolutely fundamental to what a home meant, that the word for where the fire burned became the word for the entire experience of having a place to belong. And tonight, after everything we have walked through together, the wattle and daub walls and the smoky rafters, the great hall, and the solar with its closed door, the kitchen with its spit boys and the plague-changed village, and the German tiled stove and the English great rebuilding, I want to come back to that fire, to what it actually meant, to the question I promised I would answer. What happened when a medieval person came inside? Let me paint you a picture. It is a November evening somewhere in England, somewhere in the early 1300s. The sun went down 2 hours ago. There is no moon tonight, and the darkness outside the village is the kind of absolute darkness that modern people almost never experience, the kind of dark where you genuinely cannot see your hand in front of your face. A man has been working the field since before dawn. His hands are raw from the cold. His boots are wet through. He's carrying the last of what needs to come inside before the temperature drops further tonight. He reaches the door of his house. He stops for just a moment, not because he needs to rest, because of something else. Something that happens at the threshold of every home, that has happened at every threshold since human beings first built structures against the dark. The smell of smoke. And under it, the smell of whatever is cooking. And under that, the particular smell of this specific house, of the people who sleep here, and the animals who sleep beside them, and the straw on the floor, and the wood of the walls. The smell of his life. He pushes the door open, and inside the fire is burning. Now here is the question that I've been working toward all night. Was that moment, that specific moment of crossing the threshold of the warmth reaching him of the fire seen through the smoke, was that moment meaningfully different in its essential emotional content from the moment you walk through your front door at the end of a long day? I've thought about this for a long time, and my honest answer is less different than we think, far less different. The experience of coming home, of crossing from the outside world into the space that holds your life and the people you love, is not a modern invention. It is not a product of comfort or privacy or central heating. It is something that has been built into human beings for as long as human beings have built shelters. The Anglo-Saxons believed the hearth fire should never be allowed to go out because its flame represented the continuity of the family lineage itself. To let the fire die was to say something terrible about the family's future. When a family moved to a new home, they carried coals from the old hearth to light the new one. The fire was not just heat. It was the family travelling with them. The Romans dedicated their household fires to Vesta, goddess of the eternal flame. The hearth was the altar of the home. To be received at someone's hearth was to be received into the protection of everything they held sacred. And in the medieval world, though the theological framework had changed, the fire at the centre of the home still held all of that weight. The historian who studies medieval households finds this pattern in document after document, in will after will, in court testimony after court testimony. The hearth is always described as the centre, not as a detail, as the point from which everything else in the domestic world radiates. There are family records from Ireland in which people take pride in being able to trace the unbroken burning of their household fire through generations, through centuries, covered with ash every night, and rekindled every morning, never allowed to go fully dark. A continuous flame connecting every morning to every morning that had come before. I find that beautiful. Almost unbearably beautiful. But here is where I want to complicate this picture slightly, because I do not want to be so romantic about the medieval home that I lose the truth of it. The medieval hearth was all of those things: warmth, continuity, sacred centre, the heart of the household. And it was also the source of lung damage, of eye irritation, of blackened walls and permanent smoke in the hair and clothes, of a mortality rate among small children that was partly attributable to respiratory complications from indoor air quality that we would today consider unacceptable. The fire was life. The fire also made people sick. And this is, I think, the deepest thing that the medieval home teaches us about the human relationship with home in general. Home has never been perfect. Home has never been comfortable in any absolute sense. Home throughout most of human history has been a negotiation between warmth and smoke, between community and the total absence of privacy, between the security of being indoors and the practical difficulties of managing a space with no running water, no electricity, no separation between the rooms where you slept and the rooms where the animals slept and the rooms where the food was cooked and the room where everything happened. And people built anyway. Invested anyway, loved their homes anyway, not because they did not notice the difficulties. They noticed them intimately. They lived inside them every day of their lives. But because the alternative, the absence of home, the darkness outside the cold, the isolation was worse. Always everywhere and for everyone, the alternative was worse. Let me tell you what happened at Warren Percy. We talked about that deserted medieval village in Yorkshire earlier, the place that was inhabited for centuries and then finally abandoned. The place where you can still see the rectangular outlines of houses in the grass, and the ruined tower of the church still stands against the open sky. Archaeologists excavated Warren Percy for decades. They found what you would expect to find: pottery bones, traces of hearths, the imprints of lives lived in small rooms. But they also found something that I think about often. They found that in some of the houses right before they were abandoned, right at the moment when the last family was preparing to leave for good, someone had made repairs. Not major repairs, not the kind that would justify staying. Just small things. A patch on a wall, some work on the roof. As if even in the act of leaving, whoever lived there could not quite resist the habit of care. The habit of looking at the place where they had lived and seeing what needed attention and attending to it, even knowing they would never sleep there again. There is something in that detail that says everything I know how to say about what home means. We take care of the places that hold our lives, not because they are perfect, not because they are comfortable, because they are ours, and that, I think, is what the medieval home was about. Not the wattle and daub, though the technique was brilliant. Not the great hall, though its theatre of power was extraordinary. Not the solar, though its emergence as a private space was genuinely revolutionary. Not the tiled stove, or the great rebuilding, or the glazed windows, or the private rooms, or any of the architectural details we've spent tonight walking through. All of that is real and fascinating and worth knowing. But underneath all of it, the medieval home was about the same thing that every home in every era, in every culture that has ever built a shelter against the darkness, has been about. The conviction, irrational, persistent, deeply human, that this particular place, these particular walls, this particular fire is worth tending, that the people inside it are worth feeding and warming and protecting, that tomorrow morning when the cold and the dark come back, and they always come back, the fire will still be burning. Now, before we close, I want to share one more thing with you. Something I have not mentioned yet tonight. A detail so small that it almost disappeared under everything else. In the English Midlands, where archaeologists have been studying medieval peasant houses for decades, they found something in the timber frames of houses built in the 14th and 15th centuries. Carpenter's marks, not just functional identification marks to help with assembly. Personal marks, individual signatures cut into the wood with a small knife or chisel unique to each craftsman. We can identify from these marks that specific carpenters worked on specific buildings. We can trace one craftsman's work across multiple structures in a village, across years, across a career. These marks are 700 years old, and looking at them, these small personal individual signatures pressed into wood that has outlasted everyone who ever touched it, I feel something that I cannot quite name. Something close to the feeling you get when you read a letter that someone wrote to a person they loved in a language you are only just beginning to understand. There was a person here. They made something. They put their mark on it. They wanted to be remembered. And they are. We began this journey in a single room on a winter night somewhere in the England of 1240. A fire burning low in the centre of a dirt floor. A family in the dark. The sound of cattle shifting at the far end of the house. We have walked over these 12 chapters through almost every kind of home that medieval Europe produced. Through the grandeur and the poverty, the ingenuity and the hardship, the sacred and the mundane. And what I hope you are taking away from tonight is not a list of facts, though. The facts are fascinating, but something more like a feeling, the feeling of recognition. Because when you look at the medieval home, honestly, when you set aside the romanticized castles and the Hollywood darkness, and the idea that these were alien people in an alien time, what you find underneath all the unfamiliarity is something remarkably close to what you experience yourself. The desire for warmth, the desire to be fed, the desire to close a door and be somewhere that is yours, the desire to make a space that reflects, however humbly, who you are and what you value and who you love. These are not modern desires. They are human desires. They are 700 years old and older, and every house ever built, from the wattle and daub longhouse on the English plain to the apartment you're listening to this in right now, every one of them is built out of the same conviction that having a home is worth the effort, that the fire is worth keeping burning, that this place in the dark and the cold and the uncertainty of the world is ours. Thank you for spending tonight with me. Genuinely thank you. You came here to rest, and I hope that somewhere in this long journey through smoke and stone and the carved marks of medieval craftsmen, you found something worth carrying with you into sleep. If this kind of history, the real kind, the human kind, the kind that reaches through 7 centuries and finds something still warm on the other side, if that is the kind of story that finds you here, then I would love for you to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you are here when the next journey begins. And if something in tonight's story moved you a detail that surprised you a moment, that made you see your own home differently, anything at all, drop it in the comments. I read them, I think about them, and sometimes the most interesting conversations start there. The fire tonight was the medieval hearth, smoky, warm, imperfect, enduring. The next fire will burn somewhere else entirely, a different era, a different kind of home, a different set of questions about what it means to be human and to make a place in the world. I will see you there. Sleep well.